One of the stories that we did is about cartel presence here in the United States. It's not happening just in the big cities, it's happening in small town America as well. I don't think I'd realized just how organized it is and how a lot of it is actually run by American citizens. The thing that scared me the most while reporting that story is we're not just talking about drugs on our streets, we're talking about the corruption of our government.
So how does the cartel recruit these Americans? Like, how do they get a hold of them?
We're not talking about corrupting somebody with a few $1,000s. We're talking about millions of dollars. The cartel keeps a very close eye on communications. Sometimes the phones are tapped, and the people that are part of that distribution don't even know their phones are being tapped by the cartel. It's really mind-blowing. Chemicals come from China. The precursor chemicals arrive in big container ships. We were there to film it, and then we filmed the lab where they make the drugs, and then we went to the border and filmed them packing the drugs, changing the smell so they weren't detected by dogs and by X-ray machines. It was really incredible. And then we saw them as they're hiding the drugs inside a car. And then we were allowed to film as a pregnant woman, American, crossed into the U.S. carrying 5 kilos. At the time, I believe it was heroin laced with fentanyl. And she was stopped, and we were stopped right next to her, and they searched her car. And
can you talk about the piece that you did on migrant smuggling?
That was one of the most chilling moments we've ever filmed, actually, because we get there and there's a dozen migrants who are on their last step of the journey, about to make it to the United States. And the cartel was waiting for the money, and they'd received the money from everyone except for this one guy.
What about, like, have you guys done stories on, on China?
Really hard. It's very, very hard. We have done stories. We did a story recently where we had an undercover team filming undercover in China, but it's really, really, really hard. It's almost impossible to go as a journalist in China. To China. But we've tried. I've been to China actually pre-reporting on the story. We went there on a scout trip to do many, many years ago. And it was one that wasn't particularly critical to the Chinese government, so that's why we were able to go. But then we ended up actually not filming it.
Interesting. So is there stuff that you guys try to do that are, maybe not the best look for the Chinese government and they don't allow it? Is that what the context is?
It's practically impossible to get. I mean, first of all, it's impossible to get a press pass or accreditation to go to China. They just, unless you're, people are vetted, particularly me, reporting on black markets, I probably wouldn't get a press visa to go to China. And also because it's, it's hard. It's really hard if you were to go there on a tourist visa, and if they find out that you're actually reporting, that's not a place you want to be caught in.
Yeah. And like, what are like the legalities of filming like discreetly undercover, like, and not telling people that you're filming them?
In general?
Yeah.
So it's a state-by-state, in the United States, for example, it's a state-by-state case. There are states that have what's called a two-party consent. So it means that if you're filming somebody, they have to know, you have to tell them that they're being filmed. But there are other states that are more lenient, and one-party states where you can film more undercover. It's actually pretty amazing that in 5 seasons of Trafficked, we filmed undercover. I think we've only filmed undercover like 2 or 3 times. Most of the filming we've done, even though it's about the criminal underworld, we filmed with the consent of the criminals or the outlaws themselves. So it's been interesting. I didn't think that was going to be the case when we started this show.
So do you guys bring we're rolling now, I think, because this is an interesting part of the conversation. But like when you guys disguise these people, like if people have seen Trafficked, like they're wearing sometimes ski masks or like other sort of decorative masks, definitely sunglasses. Do you guys bring these disguises?
Yeah, we do. Because a lot of times I think it's a lesson we learned early on where we would go to places and after months and months of trying to convince somebody to go on camera, they finally said yes, and then we get there thinking that maybe they'd bring their own disguise, and they didn't, and then there's no interview, or they don't feel comfortable. So we've learned the hard way that it's just better to bring. And we bring actually a bag full of different masks and disguises, wigs and sunglasses and gloves to hide tattoos and long sleeve T-shirts, all of it. And then we tell them to pick what they think sort of what they like and what they think sort of what they So it's a little bit of their personality coming through as well. But there have been situations. We did a scam story for season 1 in Jamaica, and it was one of the first stories. It was the first story we ever did on scams. And interestingly enough, scams weren't a big thing when we first started reporting. Like the scam industry has grown to millions and millions of dollars nowadays. But when we started 6 years ago, it was still it wasn't as big as it is now. And we had to really convince Nat Geo that this was an important story. And it was about the lottery scams. People call you and say you've won the lottery, but you have to give this amount of money in order to for the money to be released. And so in Jamaica, it was one of I think my favorite interviews, by far one of my favorite interviews of the show, where we got there and there were we interviewed many scammers, but one of these, there was like 2 young guys who showed up, and one of them had his own mask, and it was a Trump mask because he wanted to, because that's who he identified with.
Was it COVID that really blew the scamming industry up? Because I can imagine everybody's at home, and that would be a big.
Particularly the romance scams, because they really take it. One thing that black market operators are really good at doing is exploiting the weaknesses, or failures of government. And in the case of COVID, there were a lot of people that were lonely, and they really exploited that. And so romance scams in particular exploded during COVID. But I would say black markets in general exploded during COVID. I mean, drug trafficking, all sorts of black markets really went up during COVID. It was really fascinating. And we had just finished season 1 when COVID happened. And suddenly we realized, oh, wow, we have sort of a gold mine on our hands, because suddenly we look around and there's all these black markets that are growing exponentially. Yeah.
Like right back to it.
Right back to it. I mean, we actually started filming season 2 of Trafficked, I think. So lockdown happened in March. We were out filming in June. And it was, a lot of people were still at home. But yeah, we were fortunate to be able to continue working to do what I love.
Yeah. Okay. I typically give people an intro so they know what they're in for the next couple hours. So for people that may not be familiar with your face from TV already, you are an award-winning correspondent and investigative journalist, and some of those awards include a bunch of Emmys. I think 5 you guys just won that was season 3, right?
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
A Peabody, a DuPont, a Television Academy Honor, and the Livingston Award. And then, as mentioned so far, you're the host and executive producer of National Geographic series Trafficked with Mariana van Zeller. And the show is in production now as we're recording this, for the 5th season. Yep. And as we started talking about, it's such a crazy look into all kinds of different black market underworld. So I really encourage people to check it out, and I'm sure they'll want to after we wrap up today. But I was telling you a bit off camera, it's incredible. It really is. From everything from the way you guys frame up the shots and the cinematography to the way you keep your cool, and everything is amazing. So seriously, it's an honor to have you here, and thank you again for coming
Dalton.
out.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's get into some of the actual journalistic work. But so where did you grow up, and then how did you get interested in becoming a journalist?
Yeah, I grew up in Portugal, and I pretty much decided I wanted to be a journalist when I was 12 years old, very young. But I used to watch the nightly news with my family every night. It was sort of mandatory viewing for all of us. And I used to watch the anchors on Portuguese television, and they talked about what was happening all around the world, the inflation rates in China and the violence in Brazil and all these weird facts. And I thought they were the most fascinating, smartest people in the world. How could they retain so much knowledge? And so I decided then and there that this is it. I want to be a journalist because I want to have all this knowledge. And then I realized that they were actually mostly just reading from a teleprompter. So I soon made the decision that I also always loved traveling, even though I didn't do a lot of traveling growing up, but I knew I loved traveling. And so I sort of decided, okay, I want to be a field journalist, somebody that goes out in the field and starts reporting. And then I went to school in Portugal. I studied international relations. And as soon as I graduated, I started applying to Columbia's journalism school because it's one of the best journalism schools in the world, if not the best. And I applied the first year, and I didn't get in. I applied the second year, and I was put on a wait list. And I was really hopeful that this is the year, but I didn't get in a year again. So the third time that I applied, I actually got on a plane and flew to New York, and I knocked on the dean's door. And he was a very nice man, David Cartel, we'll never forget him. And he basically, we sat me down, we spoke for an hour, and that year I was accepted, and it changed my life.
Persistence, huh?
Persistence, yeah. It's a lesson that I've learned about journalism from the early days.
And that's where you met your husband, Darren, right?
And that's where I met Darren at Columbia University. And it's also sort of changed my trajectory in journalism because I was there during 9/11. I just arrived at Columbia a month before when 9/11 happened. And I'd been studying until really late the night before, so I was still asleep when the attacks happened. And I started getting phone calls nonstop. And I had both my landline and my cell phone. And I answered one phone, and it was the television station I'd worked for in Portugal. And they were telling me, you're the only Portuguese journalist we know in Manhattan. And I had no experience doing any live reporting or anything. But they said, we need you to go down midtown to the top of this rooftop building and do all the reporting live for us of what's happening today. And on the other side, I had my mom on my cell phone yelling and crying and screaming and begging me to stay home. And it was really tough moment. My sister came on the phone and told me that my mom was collapsing and fainting because she was so worried for me. And but I decided, it was what I've always wanted to do is journalism, and that and I felt like this was the moment. And I was also super curious about the events of that day, like everybody else. So went midtown. Got off to this rooftop, and there were all these journalists from around the world, many of which I recognized. They're my heroes. I was shaking. I was so nervous. And then the camera starts. I hear my name, and they start asking me questions. And I was sort of the beginning of the nightly news show that night in Portugal. It was the first sort of face that everybody in Portugal saw that night, reporting on the events. I mean, there was still smoke behind me coming from downtown. And I remember being super nervous. And then I did my live report, and I had sort of, an adrenaline that I was like, okay, I did it. And I was kind of happy. And then we'll never forget, and I always get emotional when I talk about this, and I apologize, but it's really vivid still. But walking down to the streets of New York, and seeing, people already with posters looking for their loved ones. And it was a real realization of the gravity of the moment, of the tragedy that just happened. And for me, it was life-changing because it was sort of an awakening and realization, okay, this is the kind of journalism that I want to do, is one where I can try to understand why things like this happen in the world. And so a year after I graduated from Columbia, I actually moved to the Middle East and to Syria to try to learn Arabic. And my first story I ever did was about jihadis crossing into Iraq to fight against the American military. And it was the beginning of sort of investigative journalism, trying to understand these black markets and the underworld.
Good.
No, it was long. It was a long answer. Sorry.
No, don't be. So like just thinking about, obviously got a little emotional as you would, as anyone would, seeing those things, because like those images of those people, and they waited for days afterwards. Like, and just I remember seeing all the pictures on the wall, and it's really, really sad. But like I think, in my opinion, like from a viewer's perspective, one of your biggest journalistic strength is your empathy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably how you get these people to open up a lot. So was that something that you kind of acquired over time, or have you always sort of been that way?
I think I've always, it's difficult to talk. It's difficult to talk about yourself but I think I've always been empathetic as a person. And I think I found out early on when I started reporting on people that we consider the bad guys, that that it was very easy for me to try, that whenever I was interviewing them, I was always trying to place myself in their shoes and try to see it from their perspective. And I think that's actually a very female characteristic. People always... very often I report on a world that's male-dominated, black markets, and very often I'm the only woman in the room. And I get asked a lot, what is it like for you to be a woman doing this sort of reporting? And to me, it's more, I don't do it despite being a journalist. I do it because I am a woman. And the type of reporting that I do is very much approached with this slant of empathy that's, I think, is very female. And I'm always been very curious about the world. I mean, particularly worlds where people tell you can't get access, worlds that people don't often get to see. And yeah, my approach has always been empathetic and try to really understand. It's been a real learning for me in Trafficked, to see that the majority of the people out there are people just like you and me. And that it's because of lack of opportunities and jobs that people turn to a life of crime. That nobody is born wanting to be a criminal. It's something that I truly, truly believe in.
Yeah, there is, especially here in America, there's this concept of like the good guys and the bad guys. Yeah. And a lot of the times it's used by governments to sell certain narratives and things like that. But I think what your show does a really good job of showing to people is a lot of times, and again, a lot of times it's black and white and a lot of things are inexcusable, but a lot of times they're more gray than people would like to think.
Absolutely. And I think the nuance is always very important, and the understanding of why things happen. It's really the only way that we can solve problems, right? If you don't get to to why things are happening, you're not going to be able to understand and change anything. And so that's always been a very clear sort of goal in the reporting that we do.
Mm. Okay, so you moved to Syria. What was that story on? Like you said, it was like extremists that were, or like foreign fighters that were going into Iraq to fight the Americans.
Yeah,
what was that?
At the time, it was actually Syrians who were crossing the border into Iraq to fight against the Americans. So it was right after President Bush had come out and had said that the American invasion had been a huge success. Saddam Hussein was toppled, and that everybody was greeting Americans with open arms, and everything was beautiful. And when I was at the time living in Syria, and I was hearing the opposite. I had a very good friend who was from this border region that borders between Syria and Iraq, that then actually became sort of the heart of ISIS. And there was huge al-Qaeda presence there at the time. So I had a friend who is a Syrian friend who lived in Damascus, and he started telling me, like a lot of people from my little border town in Syria, all my friends are crossing into Iraq to fight against the Americans, and some are dying and they're hailed as heroes, as martyrs in my town. The ones that are coming back are inspiring more people, even more people to go with them. And I was shocked. I was like, but this is not the narrative. Like, there's been no stories about Syrians crossing to fight against Iraqis. I mean, there was some insurgency happening in some places of Iraq, but it wasn't known that there were foreign fighters crossing at the time. And so I convinced him, my boyfriend at the time, now my husband, Darren, was visiting me in Syria at the time. And we convinced our friend to take us there. We thought it would be a great opportunity. We actually, we didn't have a camera or anything. I was there as a secret journalist. I didn't have a press pass. I wasn't allowed to be a journalist at the time. It's an authoritarian government. They were following particularly the foreign students that were living in Syria at the time. I was enrolled in the University of Damascus learning Arabic, so everybody thought I was a student. Nobody knew I was a journalist as well. And I mean, I was a freelance journalist trying to find stories. But it was even my closest friends in Syria at the time didn't know. Our conversations were being monitored. I remember calling my parents and my friends on a landline. This was before cell phones, and being very careful with the words that I used. And so when my boyfriend, now my husband, came to visit, I told him about the story, and we're like, okay, we have to go and do this story. This is crazy. Nobody's talking about this. And we didn't have a camera, so we went. At the time, I was selling carpets. I would buy carpets in Syria, ship them to my mother, who would have these tea parties and sell these rugs or carpets to her friends, and then send me the leftover money. And that's how I survived as a freelance journalist in Syria. Wow. And with part of that money as well, my Darren and I went to the border with Lebanon, bought a little camcorder, like a tourist camera, and we went to this border town and filmed sort of undercover. I mean, we filmed openly with the people we were talking to, but we weren't. We couldn't film in the streets. We were pretending we were tourists, essentially, with a little camera. And we ended up doing one of the first stories, if not the first story that came out about the foreign fighters. And it aired at the time on Channel 4 in the United Kingdom because I'd worked at a production company in the UK, so had connections there. And yeah, it's great.
So how did you get hooked up with National Geographic?
So from there, Darren and I realized that actually Darren was a print journalist, but he really enjoyed doing that story with me. And so we realized, why don't we basically start traveling around the world, the two of us, and start doing these stories that we can then sell to outlets, both in the UK and the United States. And at the time, Al Gore, former vice president, was starting his own television station called Current TV. And both Darren and I applied, and we both were basically hired. And we started working as a team, and we traveled around the world doing stories. And eventually, National Geographic reached out and said they wanted to work with us. Yeah. And this was way before. I mean, I worked for Nat Geo for a while before Trafficked even started.
Okay. So what stands out as far as the work that you guys did for Nat Geo before Trafficked started?
We did. It was interesting because a lot of the stories we were pitching were stories about black markets, and I think they early on realized, oh, this is really what they're like doing. So we did stories about gold mining in Colombia. We did a story about sex trafficking in Vegas. We actually did a story about cartels in Mexico as well. And then I was actually hired to be one of the hosts on Explore, which is one of the longest running news magazine shows on National Geographic. And again, I continued pitching stories about black markets. And eventually they reached out to me and they said, we really like the work you do. Would you be interested in having a show just about black markets? I was like, yeah, that's my dream.
Nice.
And that's how Trafficked started.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, let's get into some of the traffic stuff. And let's, I think a good one to start with is the cartel stuff, because I know that, like, as far as the reporting that you've done, it's been most extensively in Sinaloa on the cartels, right? So, and like you've covered a whole bunch of stories, like from fentanyl to guns to meth to migrant smuggling, cocaine, and like, again, not just like written about it or filmed it from afar, but like been in the room with these guys while they're wearing masks, cooking up fentanyl in a lab, like. So, but that's the first one that I watched recently where I was like, this is fucking crazy. Like, how is this on television? The fentanyl one. So, and again, for these episodes, you guys go through the full supply chain and full pipeline in a lot of cases. So can you kind of tell us what you did for that episode?
Fentanyl, yeah. So I've been reporting on the opiate crisis for many years. I started in 2007. So it's been almost 18 years reporting on the opiate crisis. It started with basically OxyContin. We did a story called the OxyContin Express, and it was about how there were these pain clinics in Florida that were dispensing OxyContin like it was candy. And we did the pipeline of OxyContin all the way to Appalachia and saw, this crazy sort of distribution of drugs. And then we realized that all these people that were getting hooked on OxyContin, then when they had trouble finding those pills, they moved on to heroin. So we did a story about heroin abuse. And then after a while, I remember perfectly well, I was in Los Angeles at my house, and I got a call from a drug enforcement contact of mine who called me and said, hey, have you heard of this thing called fentanyl? It's like popping up everywhere. It's a big concern. It's starting to become a big concern for law enforcement, and I'd never heard of fentanyl before. And I did, a Google search, and there was some reports of some fentanyl, people dying from fentanyl overdoses, but it was minimal. And I mean, again, it wasn't a drug that most people were aware of. And I remember at the time I was working for a television station called Fusion, and I called my boss and I said, hey, I'm hearing things about fentanyl, this drug, and I think there's a story here. And his first reaction was like, nobody knows what fentanyl is, and what are you talking about? I've never heard about this drug. But I persisted, and I kept at it, and I kept telling him, look, nobody knew what OxyContin was when I first reported on it. I'm telling you, if I'm hearing this from my law enforcement contacts, it is going to be big. And eventually he agreed, and our story came out before Prince died of an overdose of fentanyl. And Prince was sort of the first celebrity that really got fentanyl on the map. And people started realizing that year that we did our story was the first time that New Hampshire had more people dying. It was the only state that had more people dying from overdoses of fentanyl than heroin. At the time, again, nobody really knew what fentanyl was. But that statistic alone was, I think, a big wake-up call for people. And that's when our first story about fentanyl came out. And I remember for that story trying really hard to get access to a fentanyl lab in Mexico, and I wasn't able to. We were able to actually film with people involved in the fentanyl trade, but we weren't able to get access to the fentanyl lab itself. And so when Trafficked started, first season, I pitched a story on fentanyl because it had grown exponentially. Now everybody knows what fentanyl is. It was killing way more people than heroin or any other drug. So eventually I reached out to my contacts in Sinaloa, and that's how I found myself in a fentanyl lab. But it took months to get that access. And even the days leading up to the filming in the lab were crazy because it was the siege of Culiacan had just happened. So Culiacan had been sort of shut off. It was incredibly dangerous to be in Culiacan. National Geographic didn't want us to be anywhere close to the city. So we had to be in Mazatlan, which is in the south, and had to figure out a way to get access to this area where they were telling us that they were cooking fentanyl. And we spent actually days waiting. We would drive there and get there and wait out in the sun, and they would not show up. And this happened for I think it was 2 full days that we waited for the access. And then finally, at the end of the second day, they finally showed up. And they said, okay, follow us. And they took us and they opened this door, and there was this sort of abandoned house. And they were cooking fentanyl there, and they showed us the whole process. And it was crazy. Yeah, it was the whole masks and everything.
So, like, as far as like getting access, especially with the cartels, like, especially now, like they're practicing tradecraft, like they're trying to keep a really low profile. Like, you're not even supposed to ask them what cartel they're with. Mm-hmm. So, like, do you guys pay them?
No.
So, like, what's in it for them?
I think there's 3 answers to that. First of all, it takes, like I said, months, sometimes even years to get this access. Secondly, we rely heavily on local journalists and producers, people that have contacts, that have been reporting on these stories, that know the territory, that know the stories, and that are what I call our unsung heroes of the journalism profession, because they're really the people that are willing to share their contacts, their knowledge. Sometimes they risk way more than we do because we have, the luxury of being able to come back to our own homes. While if something goes wrong and if the people that we interview don't like the story, they are usually the local journalists are the ones most at risk. So we keep them very involved from beginning to end in the story process as well, because we want to make sure that we keep them safe as well. But often a lot of the contacts come through them first. But ultimately, there's a moment where I'm going to meet the person that I'm trying to convince to talk to us. And I think there's 3 main reasons that I found that people agree at the end of the day. It's ego. A lot of the times these are, the best counterfeiters, the best drug chemists, the best gun runners. And most times, their families don't even know what they do. So this is a chance they have to talk about what they've spent the last several years of working on. And they like to boast about how good they are at what they do, and we give them a chance to talk behind a mask. There's a really interesting Oscar Wilde quote that is something about, if you want to know the real identity of a man, give him a mask, and he will show himself to you, which I always loved, because nowadays I do a show where 90% of people wear masks. But and then I think the number 2 reason is impunity. In a lot of places in the world where we report, including in Sinaloa, they really don't see a downside to speaking to National Geographic because there's corruption and there's a complete sense of impunity where, they ultimately, nothing will happen to them if they talk to us. And then I think the third and most important reason is this, characteristic that we all share of wanting to be understood. And that's, I think, key, because I always tell people, whoever they are, that I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to try and understand why you do what you do. Again, I think that understanding of motivations is way more important. I think that shows. I treat people with respect and dignity, and they usually, vast majority of times, if you treat someone with respect, they will treat you with respect back. So I make them feel comfortable. I explain, look, I treat them like a human being, and I get them comfortable with talking, and then we sit down and we just talk. And yeah, I try never to lose eye contact. I usually don't have a set of questions with me. I let it be a conversation, and I think people understand that I'm there more because I'm curious, and they feel like it's not work. For me, it's not work, and it isn't. I still can't believe that I'm actually paid to do what I do because I'm, incredibly privileged. I do what I love.
Yeah, because like just thinking about it, like they, especially down in Sinaloa, like they get killed for a lot less than giving an interview to a journalist and, showing how the process works. So it just like speaks to the magic of the show. And I think a lot of it is probably you, like you disarm people and make them comfortable. But like, does it help having like the National Geographic name and the fact that they can just like Google you and you'll pull up and things like that?
Yeah, sometimes it helps. Sometimes I remember it was for the guns episode we did. I was in Mexico, and I was with Miguel, who's the journalist in Mexico, who's from Sinaloa, and he's appeared on a lot of traffic shows. He's a dear, dear friend. I love him to death, and we've been on crazy adventures together. And so the two of us, we were trying to gain access to this gun trafficking network in this town, and he told me, Marianita, he calls me Marianita, okay, they've agreed to meet us, but it can only be you and me. And it was like close to midnight, and you and I, just the two of us, are going to meet this guy. And when we get there, he wants to sort of see and meet you to decide if he wants to give us access or not. So there we go, Miguel and I. And one thing I always do is I always bring a pack of cigarettes because I think it always helps to sort of break the ice. And I'm not a smoker, but in situations like that where I'm nervous, I always like to smoke a cigarette, and I always like to share a cigarette with somebody else. And so that's the first thing I do. I get there, I open up a pack of cigarettes, and I ask them. And the vast majority of times people take it, and it just puts us on the same sort of level playing field. I always butcher all American things.
You speak like 3 languages, so we'll give you a pass.
Thank you. 5.
I was hoping you'd correct me.
What a bitch.
I was like, shit, was it 3?
5, but not very well.
I can barely speak English, so,
So we get there, cigarette, and this was actually a guy who did not take my cigarettes and was not very nice. And he was, and I was like, and he was like, how do I know if you're a journalist? How do I know you might be DEA? How do I know you're a journalist? And I'm showing him my phone and showing him, look, these are all the stories I've done. You can see I have an Instagram profile, and and he was like, that's BS. That to me says nothing. You could be a DEA agent, a CIA agent, and have just invented all of this, and it says nothing. So, yeah, I mean, having a show on television helps, but it doesn't help with everyone.
Mm. So for the guns episode, and we'll jump around, we'll come back to the fentanyl stuff, but like for the guns episode, like, or the gun story you mentioned, like how, especially in the news lately, like President Trump has designated the cartels a foreign terrorist organization. Mm-hmm. So like, what have you seen in terms of like how well armed and organized they actually are?
Oh, they're incredibly well organized. I mean, they make billions of dollars a year. They're, it works like a corporation. They have their finance department, they have their legal department, they have both in Mexico and here in the United States. One of the stories that we did for season 5 coming up is about the cartel presence here in the United States. And I know that it exists, I've known for many years, but I don't think I'd realized just how organized it is and how a lot of it is actually run by American citizens. And that, I think, is, when we talk about drug trafficking, I think there's usually a focus on let's build a bigger wall and let's make sure that people aren't coming across illegally. But the vast majority of drugs that come into the United States come in through legal ports of entry and are brought in by American citizens. So, again, understanding how it's actually done and gaining access to these networks is, I always find the most important way to figure out how to stop these big black markets such as drug trafficking.
So can you share a story from what you're working on around that, like the cartel presence in the U.S.? Like, what are you guys working on with that one?
Yeah, so we finished filming already. We're putting the story together. I mean, it's not only that there's cartel presence here, that they're everywhere. They're in every major city and small town. A lot of them actually are actually operating in small town America because they can be a lot more discreet. So you think of cartel and you think big cities, but it's actually happening a lot in small town America. So we actually found some cases of where that was happening. Some cases we spent time also with law enforcement in small town America, seeing some of the cases that they've brought down where there was enormous cartel presence, where they had no idea this was happening. But I think the thing that scared me the most while reporting that story is everyone knows that the cartel is bringing drugs to the United States. It is the facts that they are also bringing in the ways that they operate in Mexico, including corruption, to the U.S. And this is something that we spoke with law enforcement about. So understanding how, their way of working, that their corruption, that they're bringing in corruption, and what that can do. We're not just talking about drugs on our streets. We're talking about the corruption of our government, and that was really scary. You'll have to see the episode. It comes out this summer, but I think it was, even for somebody who's been reporting on black markets and drug trafficking for as many years as I have, it was really eye-opening.
Did you guys talk to like cartel members? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of them
in the States.
Oh yeah, we did, and I think there's a few surprises, including some of them being Americans and Americans that don't even speak Spanish. So that was really, eye-opening.
And what kind of stuff are we talking about? Like guns or drugs, or like what kind of corruption?
Mostly drugs. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is that drugs go south, come north, and then guns go south, right? That's sort of, we tend to focus a lot on the fact that all these, bad Mexicans are bringing in the drugs to the United States, and it's the Mexicans when in fact it's mostly Americans who are bringing through legal ports of entry. But also we tend to forget that a lot of the violence, drug trafficking in Mexico and in the United States would not happen without guns. Like this is how this is how they keep their territory, that this is how they traffic their drugs. Drugs and guns go hand in hand. None of it would happen without access to guns. And those guns are coming from the United States. So unless we tackle one problem, if we want to tackle drug trafficking, we also have to be able to tackle the guns that are streaming south and creating violence in Mexico and allowing these drug trafficking operations to operate.
So how does the cartel recruit these Americans? Like, how do they get a hold of them? Is it the internet?
Money. It's easy money. This is one of the things that this person that we spoke to told us. It's just, there's so much money. When you're talking about millions of dollars or billions of dollars, if you're talking about drug trafficking organizations at large, it's money. It's we're not talking about corrupting somebody with a few $1,000s. We're talking about millions of dollars. So it's just easy for them.
But do they use social media to find people?
It's through connections. So usually, it's interesting actually. Usually the first people that they send, imagine if you're trying to find a new area of the United States that they want to sell drugs, they first send a family member. It's really fascinating, actually. So initially, it's somebody that they can trust. So initially, it's a family member, and that person goes, and that person starts making connections. But then eventually, they're surrounded by other people that are Americans, and then they start their distribution center. And but the cartel keeps a very close eye on communications. Sometimes the phones are tapped, and the people that are part of that distribution don't even know their phones are being tapped by the cartel. So even though they're in Mexico, they're keeping a close eye on what's happening in the United States. It's really mind-blowing.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And this, again, it's not happening just in the big cities. It's happening in small-town America as well.
Do you guys say where on the show?
So one of the towns, it was we had to go down to Sinaloa to gain access to some of the cells here in the United States, and it took us forever. But eventually, one of my contacts in Sinaloa said, "Okay, meet us in this state this day." And we went there and we waited and waited for days. And then they called us and said, actually, we were just joking. Or it was like a side thing that, we didn't, but it's in the other state. So then we had to drive for hours, but we couldn't never reveal exactly where it was. I think in the story, we actually sort of revealed the first place because it wasn't actually the place. But then we had to go somewhere else. So yeah, some of the locations, obviously, we can't disclose. But you do see some other locations where we were able to show where we were, particularly the ones where we spoke to law enforcement.
God, that's crazy. Are you familiar with John Norris?
No.
I think that actually when you were on Rogan, he may have brought him up in the episode, but he's
I knew the name, but
John Norris. He was I think he currently is. He's a game warden in California.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's a game warden who started seeing all these marijuana cultivations.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fascinating guy.
Yeah. These like illegal grow ops. And for people that haven't heard his story, you should go check him out. But he basically, they started this like special operations unit to combat these illegal like marijuana grow operations in California.
Yeah. And
there was cartel members like bringing shit in, like supplies, setting up camp, like legit like placed operations. And prior to me listening to that, like I don't think people associate, like they think the cartels are just in Mexico. But like the fact that that was the only time that I'd heard of them being in the States until now.
Yeah, absolutely. We did that story for season 2. We did a story about weed, marijuana. And part of our story was we went out with law enforcement in California to some of those grows. And I'd done this story previously several years ago. So I've been out in those forests in California where you see these massive marijuana grows. And a lot of the time, I think this is also part that's not known, is that it's more than cheap labor. They bring in people from Mexico that they tell, or Central America, that they tell them they're going to work in farming, picking strawberries or oranges. But in fact, when they get here, they're put in these marijuana grows and they're left there because usually it's in really remote places. So they bring in these workers and they say, okay, now you stay here and you take care of this area. And once a week we will they come in and they'll bring backpacks with food and fertilizer and whatever they need. They're stealing the water. John Norris talks a lot about that, but they're stealing the water from rivers and diverting the water, which is bad for the environment. They're using really terrible chemicals that also ruin the environment, and there's wildlife dying and all of that. And they're using what is almost forced labor because and I actually I went on a raid with police in California where they took down or they arrested some of the guys that were working there, and their stories were so sad. They went to jail, but we were actually able to interview them after they were arrested. And they were telling us, look, I spoke to their wives, actually. They gave them the contact, and I spoke to their wife, one of their wives in Mexico. And, I mean, these were people who had been brought in false pretenses to the United States, were forced to work in these areas, in these marijuana grows, and paid very, very little. And then they're the ones being arrested. And it was really sad. I don't think that's the goal of law enforcement. Obviously, they want to get higher up, but that's always hard to get to the top.
Mm. And so, like, as far as like, I think the general public might be aware of like the fact that the cartels use American citizens to bring drugs over the border because they're less likely to be questioned by Customs and Border Patrol at the border if it's an American citizen. And in fact, you guys show it in the show. But as far as like the other things that they want to do in America, is it just like situations like that, like getting Americans to bring drugs over the border, or like do they have other plans for things that they're doing here?
They want access to the consumer market, and that's America. People aren't buying drugs to the extent that they are here in other places, in Mexico or elsewhere. It's the consumer market is here. This is where they can make money, and they have the demand is growing, and there's something. As somebody who's been covering the opiate crisis for as many years as I have, that still blows my mind how this is allowed to happen. I mean, we're talking about 1 million Americans who have died in the past 25 years, since 2000. 1 million Americans. That's more Americans than the Americans that have died in wars in the past 150 years, and that's including the First and the Second World War. I mean, I spoke about 9/11 before. That day, 3,000 Americans died, and it was a tragic day. But because of those attacks, I mean, they changed systems in government. You know, billions of dollars went to trying to prevent terrorist attacks. And yet we've been living with an opiate crisis for decades, where, again, 3,000 Americans die, more than 3,000 Americans die every week. And there is a complete and staggering failure of government to address it. And as much as we try to think of it or spend money in the law enforcement and trying to stop these drugs, this is a public health crisis. And, we cannot arrest ourselves out of a public health crisis. It's about demand. Why is there this demand? What can we do? How can we, make sure that the people that are in need of treatment get that treatment? It's whatever we've been doing, this war on drugs that has started with Nixon until now, where billions of dollars have been spent, is not working because more people are dying now than ever before. So we have to completely shift our perspective and try to figure out what we can do that's different.
I mean, the Sacklers are the most ruthless cartel that there is.
I mean, it was, pharmaceutical companies in America that started this, the opiate crisis. And that's, again, one thing that people don't talk enough about. We tend to point the finger at Mexico and Mexicans as being bad. But in fact, this was created by pharmaceutical companies in America. And the demand is here. And unless we curtail that demand and we figure out how to solve this, it's going to continue.
So this one's probably going to ruffle some feathers, but New Year's resolutions are stupid. If you want a better body, go to the gym, work out, eat clean, do it consistently. If you want to drink less alcohol, be an adult and hold yourself accountable to it. If you want to stop smelling like old socks, get yourself some whole body deodorant by Mando. So Mando's whole body deodorant was created by a doctor who saw firsthand how normal body odor was being misdiagnosed and mistreated. It's safe to use anywhere on your body, so including your armpits, your butt crack, your balls, and even your feet. All of their products are baking soda free and paraben free, and they're clinically proven to control odor for up to 72 hours. So they have a bunch of different product options. This one I keep in my bathroom. This one I also keep in my bathroom next to my toilet. These smell great, by the way. And this spray I keep in my gym bag. You can choose from a variety of different scents as well. This one is bourbon leather, which smells nice. I like Mount Fuji. They also have Pro Sport and Clover Woods. So you can now find them in Walmart, Target, and other retailers across the country. But for the best deals, you're going to want to go online to shopmando.com. So Mando's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, a cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice, like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. And as a special offer for listeners, new customers get $5 off a starter pack with our exclusive code. So that equates to 40% off your starter pack if you use code Dalton at shopmando.com. Again, that's code DALTON at shopmando.com. So it's a great way to support the show, along with smelling fresher, staying drier, and boosting your confidence. What's up, guys? One of the sponsors of today's episode is Stopbox. So if you haven't heard of Stopbox, this is a Stopbox. I use this for a couple reasons. So I live in an apartment. If I feel like going to the range, I usually bring my rifle bag, right? It's big, it's obvious, it's got a big American flag patch on it. And a lot of times, lately especially, I just feel like shooting my pistols. And I definitely don't want to bring them out of my apartment building in like your standard Glock or SIG pistol case. It's very obvious. So I'll bring them in this. It's very inconspicuous. It's just a black box, doesn't have any labels on it. and it's secure. It's got a mechanical lock, so you don't have to worry about a battery on it. The other reason I use it is also because I live in an apartment. So I keep my carry pistol in it so that it's secure. I have maintenance guys coming into my apartment. Sometimes, I'll have kids coming in for whatever reason. Who knows? My pistol is secure. But when I go to leave the apartment, I could just pop the box open and grab it. So for a limited time only, our listeners are getting a crazy deal. If you go to stopboxusa.com and use code Dalton at checkout, you get 10% off and buy one, get one free on this StopBox Pro model. That's 10% off and a free StopBox Pro when you use code Dalton at stopboxusa.com. Back to the show. So to that point, what about the cartels are involved in like fake pharmaceuticals too, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, so it was a story we did last season about fake pills, and it was really fascinating. I mean, 20 million Americans have to resort to fake pharmaceuticals or counterfeit pharmaceuticals because they can't afford their medication here in the United States. The majority of them have health insurance and they still can't afford their medication. We pay more for drugs, for pharmaceuticals in America than anywhere else in the world. I mean, we're talking about pills that cost, medication that costs $500 here, and you cross the border down to Mexico and they cost $70 immediately, the same exact medication. So something is very wrong in a system where 20 million Americans have to figure out a way to get their life-saving medications in a black market, right? It's a systemic problem. And so it was really interesting for us when we started looking at this and trying to figure out where these pills were coming from and how, again, it's one of those situations where the cartel is exploiting a government problem, a problem that exists here in America. And in this case, it's pharmaceuticals.
So in the episode, first of all, I commend you for you. There's one part where you sit down in D.C. with this lady who's like a front-facing rep for this conglomerate of it was all Pfizer, all the big ones.
Yeah.
And you push her on that exact point. Like it's basically she kind of disputes the fact that Americans go down to Mexico for cheaper medicine. But you basically say it's technically accessible, but is it accessible because it's so expensive? People can't afford it. So is it really? And you did a really good job pushing back on her. So I appreciated that.
Thank you. One of the questions that I had for her, in that case, I actually did have a list of questions because I wanted to make sure that I was asking her all the correct questions. But there was one of the questions was not pre-written. And it was, as I'm talking to her, and I'm talking to her about all these millions of Americans who can't afford their medication. And imagine, you have a life-threatening condition, and you know that you need those drugs to survive, and you do not have access to that medication because at the end of the day, and I spoke to Americans about this, many, who at the end of the day, they have to pick between food or their life-threatening or life-saving medication. It's an impossible decision, right? And so when I was talking to her, I just felt like there was a complete disconnect between what she was telling me and what I was hearing from these Americans. And so at one point I remember asking her, have you actually, as somebody who represents the pharmaceutical companies, and one of the big gripes that people have with pharmaceutical companies is that the price of medication is too high. So as somebody who represents those companies, I asked her, have you actually ever sat down or met any of these Americans who have to make those tough decisions at the end of the month? And her answer was no. She had never actually spoken to people who are struggling and who can't afford those medications, which to me is mind-blowing. If you are representing pharmaceutical companies that are providing, supposedly providing these medications to Americans, don't you also want to understand the people who are receiving these medications and try to understand how we can make the whole system better? A system that can protect both the pharmaceutical companies, but also the Americans that are taking these medications. It's mind-blowing. And it was a really revealing moment for me of the complete disconnect that exists and the lack of care that exists for Americans in general, as long as the pharmaceutical companies can continue making money.
Yeah. They don't care. They don't give a shit. They hire somebody like that to basically be their public face and take the hits and respond and be their defense as best as they can. And then once it calms down, and that's it. They don't give a shit about Americans.
Yeah.
But So as far like in that episode, this is in Sinaloa, right? Or is it somewhere else?
So it was in Mexico City, actually.
Okay, Mexico City. So in the episode, you again covering the full supply chain, which is another part of the show that I love so much. Like it's so crazy. Like from the beginning of the episode, you'll be like, oh yeah, like these fake pharmaceuticals are manufactured in India, and then it's like cut to Mariana walking around the streets in India. It's so awesome. But anyway, when you're there, you talk to a woman who's an American citizen, and she has these extremely expensive prescriptions that are keeping her alive. Mm-hmm. And so she comes down to Mexico and goes to these pharmacies to buy the drugs that are like a fraction of the price that they are in the States.
In her case, I think it was actually the medication she needs costs, I think it was $400 or $500 in the United States, and it was $70 in Mexico City, which is insane.
Insane. So, and you also talk to a cartel member who goes to a pharmacy and basically shakes them down and says, if you don't put these fake pills on your shelf, we're going to burn you down.
That's right.
And so like, okay, so they're doing that, if you could talk about that, but are these pills making their way into America yet?
Yes. I mean, we were with law enforcement in Los Angeles. We went on a raid and where they found a lot of pharmaceuticals, counterfeit pharmaceuticals that were coming from Mexico. So absolutely, they're out here. They're out, but also, I can't. It's millions of Americans. I can't remember the exact number, but millions of Americans that cross the border into Mexico every year to buy their cheaper medication. And right on the border, we went to a town called Algodones, which is they have the biggest concentration of anywhere in the world of pharmacies and dental offices, and it's of anywhere in the world. There's like a huge concentration. I mean, you were driving down the street and it's all in English too, even though you're in Mexico. It's like dental office, pharmacy, doctor's office, pharmacy, everywhere. It's catering to Americans across the border. It's right on the other side of the border who come here to buy cheaper meds and to cheaper doctors and medical. And it was really fascinating. And so in these towns, and we spoke to the cartel, they're shipping drugs, and they're forcing sometimes these pharmacies to carry their counterfeit medication. And look, and sometimes, we were with a chemist in Mexico City, and he told us that when he makes these fake pills, a lot of times he just uses fake ingredients, that it's not toxic or it won't kill you. But it's nonetheless incredibly dangerous because, if you have any sort of infection or you need antibiotics, and if you think you're taking antibiotics, but you're actually not, and there's nothing there, it's dangerous in itself. But he saw himself as a good guy. He says, look, I'm doing this, but at least I'm not harming anyone. However, there was an incredible LA Times investigation done where they actually were able to go to some of these pharmacies, bring them back to labs in America, where they found out that a lot of these drugs were laced with fentanyl and meth, and these are on our streets as well.
Yeah, and like, I think in a lot of cases, like because another thing that you do, like you always ask them, like, are you aware that this is, has downstream effects? Are you aware that this is killing people? And like, some of them are just honest about it, and some of them are like, I know, I got to make money. But others, like, they do what you just said. They're like, oh, well, it could be worse. There's people doing worse things, and like that's how they justify it to themselves. And
yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, particularly that he was a chemist. His dad was a chemist. He talked about how he's a doctor as well, which is interesting. He's both a chemist and a doctor. He owned a pharmacy where he would make the pills, and he also these fake pills, and he was also a doctor. And I said, you swore an oath of do no harm, and yet you're doing this. And he believed that he really wasn't doing any harm because at least he wasn't putting some of the toxical, fentanyl or some of the other things that could kill you that he knows other chemists who are doing. So in his mind, he was not doing a bad thing. But also, one thing that you can never forget when you're reporting, particularly in Mexico, is that a lot of times these people, we think they have an option or choice, and they don't. And then, for all intents and purposes, and I know because he was afraid of some of the things he was saying, he's operating under the order of the cartel. And so it's tough to know if he really has the option to not do what he was doing.
So how many people, like, I guess Cartel specifically, like, how many of those people are doing it because they have no other options or opportunities versus how many people get into it because of like the allure of the lifestyle?
I would say from the people that I've interviewed around the world in all sorts of different black markets, about 90% are doing it because they have no other option. Of course, it's rare that we actually interview the people at the top, right? We usually interview the chemists or the smugglers or the traffickers and not the actual cartel bosses themselves. I'm not sitting down and interviewing El Chapo as much as I've tried, actually. um, or El Mayo, or all of these big drug bosses. But when you interview the people that are actually doing the vast majority of the work, the people that are necessary for these cartels and trafficking organizations to operate, those people at the bottom of the rung are usually doing it because they have no other options. I mean, I've interviewed sicarios in Mexico, assassins in South Africa, and I'm always fascinated by how they got there, and that's always a question I have, like, how do you become what you've become? And the vast majority of times, it is really a lack of opportunities. And if everybody around you is doing it, if you grow up in an environment where your father, your grandfather, and you don't have an education, and you have dreams and aspirations and goals just like everybody else. You want to be able to feed your family, and you want to be able to, pursue happiness and well-being. And this is the only thing that's afforded to you. This is what you take. And so I always say it's your choices are only as good as the options you're given. And that's what I find in these black markets more often than not.
So how close have you gotten to actually getting an interview with El Chapo or El Mayo?
So El Chapo was before he was arrested and deported to the United States. He had just fled the Altiplano high security prison in Mexico for the second time, and it was all over the news in the United States. Everybody was talking about El Chapo, and this was 2016. And I was on the phone with my friend Miguel, and in Mexico, and everybody believed he was hiding somewhere in Sinaloa, and I was like, Miguel, I mean, let's go see what the search for the most wanted man in the world looks like. I know we probably won't get close to him, but maybe we will. So let's just go on an expedition where we can see what the search for this man looks like. And he agreed. And so a few days later, I was in Sinaloa with my camera team, and we decided if he's hiding anywhere, he's going to be hiding where he's from, which is a small town in the middle of the Sierra Madre Mountains in Sinaloa called La Tuna. It's where he was born and raised, where his mother still lives or lived. She passed away recently. And so let's go to La Tuna and see if we can make it there. And this is a very remote area. It took us 3 days to actually get there in, a 4x4 off-road. And what was mind-blowing, and I didn't think would ever happen, was that actually we were able to get to the town, because I thought we'd either be stopped by the cartel or by the military who was actively, or law enforcement who were actively looking for El Chapo. And but in fact, we did get to La Tuna, and I remember arriving right outside of La Tuna, and there were these two or three guards, military, and we rolled down the window and they said, "What are you guys doing here?" And I said in Spanish, "We've come to try to talk to El Chapo," but jokingly. And their reverence for El Chapo, even, the military in Sinaloa, was, you could see it. And they laughed and they said, "Okay." They saluted us and they said, "Go on, do your thing. You can go." And so we went all the way to La Tuna, to El Chapo's mother's house. We knocked on the door. And we asked if we could speak to her. Immediately, we were sort of surrounded. Initially, they said no, that we had to leave, but we'd come for 3 days. We'd driven to get here, so we weren't going to leave easily. And so we decided, let's just stick around the town and see if we can talk to some other people, interview some other people. So we went down to the church that was built by El Chapo, which is very close to the mother's house. The mother's house is a big house that sits at the top of the hill. It's the biggest house in town, so you recognize it immediately. And underneath there's a church that he also built. And we get to the church and we're talking to the wife of the priest. who's not there at the time. And suddenly these 4x4 bikes, what do you call those things?
Oh, the ATVs or quads?
ATVs, yeah, these quads come, these guys in these quads come, and they ask, El Chapo's people want to talk to you. And I said, okay. And they said, not you. They want to talk to him. And they pointed to our camera guy who was holding Pete, Pete Alton, who's holding the camera, who's the only person in our crew who doesn't speak Spanish, by the way. And I said, no. I'm the boss, so take me, because I really wanted to talk to Chapo's people. So just take me. And they said, no, they're not interested in talking to you. They're only interested in talking to him. I was like, but he doesn't speak Spanish. And they were like, I don't care. They want to talk to him. And I turned to Pete, and Pete looks at me and says, what shall I do? And I said, Pete, I can't tell you what to do. And he asked me, what would you do? I was like, Pete, I'm dying to go. So I would happily go if I could go myself. And then Pete is like, okay, I'll go. And so the last image that we had was Pete in the back of this quad, like with holding a camera and waving like goodbye to us. And then there's a moment where the quad disappears, and we're thinking, and it's me, Miguel, and this the other guy, Alex, who I work with. And we're looking at each other. This was the stupidest thing we've ever done. Number one rule in journalism is that the team never separates. And that's just a bad idea, particularly in a place like this. And we're and as we're thinking, what are we doing? We're so nervous. Maybe what are they doing to Pete? We see the quad coming back down, and it's Pete with the guys, and all of them are armed, obviously, as well, and they all have these walkie-talkies that they're walking around with. And Pete says, okay, I spoke to him. He speaks in English, and he wants money. And there's somebody on the phone, basically, up there who speaks in English, and they want money for you to be able to interview the mother of El Chapo. And so I told the guy, okay, if they want to negotiate, it has to be with me. I know it's strange. I'm the only woman. Usually this is not how things go down in Mexico, but I'm telling you, I'm the boss. If they want to negotiate, they have to talk to me. And I knew that we weren't going to pay any money because that's not what we do. But I wanted an opportunity to speak to this person who spoke in English. And so they took me back up, and I was able to speak to somebody on the phone. We believe that it was one of El Chapo's sons who speaks English fluently. I'm quite sure, actually, it was. And again, he asked us for money, and I said, I couldn't pay. We're journalists. We'd love to give you an opportunity to speak or speak to somebody in the family. And they said, well, mi niña, my child, if you're not giving me money, then you have 10 minutes to leave town, or I'm going to send my guys after you. And again, I'm surrounded by armed guys with walkie-talkies. And so we had 10 minutes to leave town. And that was as close as we got to El Chapo. Interestingly enough, we know that he was in the region. And just a few months later, Sean Penn went to that same region where he ended up scooping me and interviewing El Chapo. And the first thing that Sean Penn told El Chapo, because he wrote it in the article he wrote for the Rolling Stones at the time, was that he met El Chapo, and El Chapo had no idea he was so famous in the United States. And Sean Penn referenced our story that we had put together from that, which was called Chasing El Chapo. And he said, there's a story that's playing on repeat on American television called Chasing El Chapo. So you are very famous in the United States.
Damn it.
I know.
Oh, so my goodness. Can you imagine?
So close.
Wow. How much money did they want?
I don't know if there was an actual, I don't think they actually said any amount, but they wanted money, and we couldn't do that.
Yeah. Which one of his sons do you think it was?
I think Miguel at the time, because I relayed the information to Miguel. Miguel is from Sinaloa, knows a lot more about the Sinaloa cartel than I do, even though I've reported there extensively. I think Miguel thought it was Ivan, but I'm not sure. And some of his sons do speak English fluently, and obviously he has a lot of connections in the United States. Some of his wives, some former wives, still live here, and so it was a chilling moment. I mean, we don't easily get scared, but that was a moment that was like, okay, this is not a good idea.
Poor Pete waving goodbye.
Oh my. It's a story that I still have that video actually with Pete. Because last minute, like as he was going up, I thought, I might as well just film it. So I filmed it with my phone as he's going up.
Oh my gosh. Maybe you send it to me. I'll loop it in so people can see it afterwards, if that's okay. And you mentioned Culiacan. Were you guys there during
The
Black Thursday, or that's what it's called, right?
Culiacanazzo, yeah.
Can you explain to people what that was?
Yeah, the Culiacanazzo was basically the siege of Culiacan. What happened is that the law enforcement, the Mexican government was able to finally catch and arrest Ovidio Guzman, who's a son of El Chapo Guzman. So when El Chapo was arrested and extradited to the United States, part of the Sinaloa cartel, at least, is being run by his sons, the Chapitos, as they're called. And one of them is Ovidio Guzman. So they basically detained Ovidio Guzman, and the Sinaloa cartel, which was an incredible moment, all came together. So all the different factions of the Sinaloa cartel came together and basically said, oh, you're not going to do this. You're not going to arrest one of our bosses. And they brought the Mexican government in Sinaloa to their knees. And they basically stormed in with guns. I mean, they had RPGs on trucks. They had their AK-47s, heavily armed, all the factions together. They surrounded the city, and they said, unless you release Ovidio Guzman, we are going to start killing civilians and people in the city. They surrounded one of the military compounds where the families of the military generals and all of it were staying or lived, and they surrounded it. And I spoke to people in the Sinaloa cartel that were there that day. Some of them were surrounding that area, that military compound. And they told us, they said, look, we got a call on all our radios that day, and they said, everybody get together. And they offered payments. They offered money for everybody to come together. And they said the Sinaloa cartel has never been more united than that day, where everybody was there to save Ovidio Guzman. And the Mexican government had no other option than to release him. And I interviewed a police officer that day also, or a few days later, where she told me, she started crying in the interview. She said, as somebody who's devoted her life, and risked my life to saving and protecting the Mexican government, it was the saddest day of my life when they just opened their hands and released this man. And we realized who really was in charge here. It was the Sinaloa cartel.
It's so insane, like, thinking about something like that happening. Like, obviously being an American and not having been to places like that. But it's just so wild thinking about, like, a rogue militia bringing a government to its knees and saying, like, no, we're going to keep killing people. And, like, those people that were outside their families' homes, like, weren't they going to set them on fire?
Yeah, that's what they threatened to do. We're going to set everyone on fire if you don't release Ovidio immediately. Eventually, 2 years ago, Ovidio Guzman was detained and arrested and extradited to the United States. And it went full circle because it actually was related then to the capture of El Mayo, which is the other big boss. It was El Chapo and El Mayo, the two big bosses of the Sinaloa cartel. But it's and now Sinaloa is living one of its most violent times ever. I think the strategy from the United States for many years has been the kingpin strategy, which is you go after the bosses of these cartels. But there's a lot of evidence out there that actually not only doesn't work, but actually hurts and brings in more violence. Because once you take the head of a cartel down, there's a lot of infighting, different factions, different people that try to become the boss and then the new boss. And what happens is a lot of times the people that actually become the new bosses are the most ruthless and the most violent because they got there by being the most ruthless and the most violent. And oftentimes they're more violent than the previous boss. And what also happens a lot of times is that it makes rival factions like the CJNG, which is one of the biggest cartels in Mexico nowadays, it makes them believe that, okay, the Sinaloa cartel is weakened, it's our time to come in, and it starts, wars between cartels. And at the end of the day, the very sad part about this is that it's, the regular citizens that then suffer and end up a lot of times being killed.
Yeah, it's just a power vacuum.
Yeah, Exactly.
I had somebody in here who was a Delta Force operator, and so he was in here, and he gave me an analogy about terrorism specifically, and it's about like it's called terrorism is like digging a trench. So it's like basically you have one person that starts digging a trench, and he's a terrorist. And he gets, a couple feet down, right? And then he gets killed. And then the next guy comes and he picks up the shovel and he says, well, he must have done something wrong. Like maybe he wasn't being as smart as I am. Like,
Right.
I'll dig the hole a little deeper if the object is to dig a trench. And maybe he digs like a foot deeper and he gets killed. Like, the point is, like, you need to make it so that the shovel is a death sentence to deter people from picking it up in the first place. So, like, again, if there's no repercussions, if the Mexican government can't do anything about it, like, what the hell do they think arresting the head is going to do?
Yeah. Yeah. And if we cannot take care of demand, if we can't stop people from wanting to buy it, because as long as there's demand, there is going to be somebody out there who's willing to do whatever they can to make that money, to make a profit, and as long as it's lucrative, and that's where, you can't arrest yourself out of a public health problem. It's what I keep saying. So it's interesting because he sees it from a very different perspective than I do. Yeah, I completely understand his analogy, and he's right. But I do think that at the end of the day, we have to go and understand the root causes and what is causing this. And what is causing this is the millions of Americans who are addicted to drugs. And how can we stop this addiction is by actually taking care and investing in treatment and solutions and ways that can make people, take care of it as if it is the public health problem that it is. And instead, we're spending money elsewhere in a war on drugs that hasn't shown any results whatsoever.
So going back to the fentanyl episode, there's a point where you watch these drugs go across the border. And I have a question for you on that I just thought of. So can you describe to people like what the context was there and how that girl took them across?
Yeah. So after filming in the fentanyl lab, we really wanted to see the whole process. So we saw when the chemicals come from China, the precursor chemicals arrive in big container ships. We were there and filmed it, arriving in Mexico, and then we filmed the lab where they make the drugs, and then we went to the border and filmed them packing the drugs. And making it smell, changing the smell so they weren't detected by dogs, and not so that they're not detected in X-ray machines. It was really incredible. And then we saw them as they're hiding the drugs inside a car, and then we were allowed to this day. I'm not sure why or why they gave us this incredible access, but we were allowed to film as a woman. Pregnant at the time, a pregnant woman, American as well, crossed into the U.S. carrying 5 kilos. At the time, I believe it was heroin laced with fentanyl. And we were there, and we saw her, and she was stopped, and we were stopped right next to her, and they searched her car. And what was incredible, the things that are going through my mind at the time was, I reported a lot on the opiate crisis, and I've spent a lot of time with the mothers of people who have died from overdoses. And I kept thinking there was something that was making me very uncomfortable about the fact that I was seeing these drugs come across the United States and knowing the harm that they can do. And I felt really uncomfortable. It was a moment that it was one of the hardest moments for me as a journalist, because I kept thinking, the mothers that I've spent time with, how are they going to judge me for being in this position? And my thought also is, what can I do? I can go and tell the police, Border Patrol, that actually this woman is carrying drugs and she will be arrested and they'll confiscate these drugs. And what impact will I have then? Yes, I'll get one person off the streets. Or shall I report on this and show the reality that the vast majority of drugs are coming across through legal ports of entry? And by showing how these drugs make it from A to B, how the process works, hopefully I will show how it's done and, force people to act and try to stop this. And so, it was a difficult moment. And eventually she makes it across, and we were able to speak to her once we were already in the United States with the drugs. And I asked her, weren't you scared? you were stopped, your car was being searched. Weren't you scared? And she says, oh, no, that guy that was searching my car, oh, I know him well. I come here across all the time. He works for the cartel. And this is why I crossed at this time of the day.
So they're paying off the border agents?
In this case, that's what she told me.
Do you think maybe they might have been telling her that to put her at ease or something?
I mean, corruption in border agent corruption has been reported extensively. I mean, there's many cases where that's been the case. Again, it goes back to the amount of money. When we're talking about millions of dollars, it's so much money is easily corruptible, right? It's easy to corrupt somebody with this large amounts of money. So, yeah, I mean, we saw it. We saw how easily she got off. I mean, yeah.
So, to your point about like kind of being conflicted, like again, you live in America, you live in California, you're an American citizen, and you've dealt intimately, as you said, with the moms of these people that have died from the stuff that's being brought across the border. Like, how do you? Like, you're a journalist, right? Mm-hmm. You're there to capture this moment. And we can kind of talk about, in my opinion, the pros of this one outweigh the cons. And there's an element to it. There's nuance to every story, in my opinion. But like, what is the line for you? Like, if you're trying to reconcile that in your head, is like, what would be the line with what you're not comfortable being a journalist for and watching, if there is one?
Yeah, whenever there's actual harm being done to a human being or an animal. So I've said this many times. So if I know that, for example, people have been kidnapped and I know where those people are, or I know that somebody is about to be killed or tortured or harmed in any way, or an animal is about to be harmed or tortured in any way, and I know that I can, stop that from happening at that very moment, then that's the line. And I think that's the line for the vast majority of journalists. But in terms of shining a light to systemic failures in our government, because that's essentially the beginning of a black market. It's how it all starts. It's the exploitation of systemic failures. That's how, whether you're talking about guns, drugs, fake pills, even scams. So it's my job as a journalist is to sort of see the larger picture and try to expose that larger picture. And I think that's, but there's a line. I had a journalism professor once who gave me a really good piece of advice, which is, as journalists, there's always a line, and you don't want to cross that line, but you want to make sure that you come back with chalk on your feet.
Huh. Wow, I love that.
Yeah, me too.
And you do, and you most certainly do.
Very often.
So
sometimes too much chalk.
Well, like, to that point, like, is that like, again, you do a really good job of pushing people, and there's a difference between like pushing someone in a comfortable situation like this versus pushing someone to a point where there might be repercussions for both of you. Like, if they say too much.
I think I'm good at reading a room, and I think I do always ask. You see I always ask the questions that they tell me I'm not supposed to ask or I can't ask, even before they tell me, okay, don't. And unless I think it's actually, if I ask them that question, they can be killed. But for example, in Sinaloa or in Mexico in general, you know that if you're talking to a cartel member, you're not supposed to ask them which cartel they work for. And we are told always, do not ask that question. I always ask, usually I know beforehand also, but I always also want to ask, well, like, what faction? And I always ask that on camera. And I know that, you can tell. I can tell when I'm going too far, and I'll back off. If I think, okay, I'm putting myself or my team in danger, then I'm going to back off. But I do try to push it as much as I can. And I think I'm pretty good usually at reading a room. I mean, there have been few situations. There have been situations in which I think maybe I've pushed it too far, and I've made my team uncomfortable. But more often than not, I think I know how to read the room.
So why are you not supposed to ask what faction they're with or what cartel they're with?
Because it's not, because it can put that person's life in danger if they talk too much about the cartel. I mean, they know that they're not supposed to be talking about cartel secrets. And so even exposing the name of the cartel or the faction that they belong to, a lot of times they do what they do without the big boss's consent. Because, again, they want to talk about themselves, and because they want to be understood, or because they want to boast about how good they are. And so if they start talking too much, they can get in trouble.
Okay,
But the opposite also sometimes happens, where you think that they don't want to talk about their cartel, and then you start interviewing them, and they talk about their cartel nonstop because they want to say that the Sinaloa is more powerful than CJ&G or vice versa.
Ego.
Yeah.
So then, like, going back to again, like the border. Again, in my opinion on this one, like, I think that the pros, as I mentioned, outweighed the cons for bearing witness to something like that. Because number one, it's a drop in the bucket as far as like how much shit comes across the border every single day. But that's not the point. I think the point is that there's things like sex trafficking, which we can talk about because that's here inside the U.S., that there's things that are inexcusable because there's, in that case, force, fraud, or coercion. Like, they're forcing people to do things and hurting them. Like, to your point, like, there's Americans that are making the choice to buy these drugs and put them in their body. Nobody's forcing them to do that. So, like, again, exposing that, I think, in my opinion, like, outweighs the actual cons. But you and the team are the ones that have to live with that, right? So, like, how do you think of, okay, so like that was in California, right? You go home that night, like you're having a beer with Darren, like, and you're thinking to yourself, like, what the fuck did I just watch? Like, what's going through your head? Like, is there ever a time where you're like, this job is...
Oh, dude, that day that we filmed that woman going across the border and bringing 5 kilos of heroin laced with fentanyl into California, she was bringing them actually to LA. I went straight, we filmed her at the border, we filmed her crossing, we spoke to her, and then she went her way. And I went home, and I didn't go home. I went straight to a soccer practice for my son, who at the time was 6 or 7 years old. And I was with other mothers who were telling me about how crazy their day had been because they had just gone to all these different, soccer and sports practices for their kids. And I was like, I can't even begin to tell you how crazy my day has been. And it was pretty insane. And I remember having a big dinner that night with my husband and my team. I invited my whole team to come to dinner at my house, and us all sharing our stories. I mean, that's one big important part of that I force my team to do is every night after we film or at the end of the day, whenever it is that we finish filming, that I like if we can all get together and share a meal, share some drinks, and talk about the events of that day. Because it isn't always easy, and most often it's not actually easy, and we see some pretty awful shit. And so to be able to just talk about it, it's our own little therapy session, particularly if it's over a glass of wine or beer. I think it's really important.
Definitely, yeah. It's a decompression, right?
Yeah, decompression, and it's our way of like trying to process what just happened. Like, that was one of the days. It's like, holy shit, what did we just do? Is this okay? How are we going to show this on television? And eventually, I did actually reach out to some of the mothers that I'd spoken with, and I shared the story with them, and I was very grateful to them that they were very understanding. And they said, look, at the end of the day, I think your job of explaining and showing what's happening is more important than, getting this pregnant woman in prison. But it's tough. It's really tough sometimes. But I don't think I've ever crossed the line in a way that's made me feel that I shouldn't have done it. It's made me feel I've been very close, and I felt very uncomfortable at times, and I've had many conversations about this. But I don't think I've ever done anything that, looking back, I say, if I'd go back, I'd do it completely different. I don't think it directly affected anyone's life negatively.
So is there anything that you, like, after those therapy decompression sessions, is there anything that sticks with you kind of more than others still, like, that you think about more often?
Yeah, I the Niger coup. We were in Niger doing a story about gold trafficking and how it's funding terrorism. And this is one of the most, we were in one of the most remote regions of the world. It was in the middle of the Sahara Desert where the gold mining was happening. We spent months planning this trip. It's one of the most dangerous places on earth. There's every terrorist brand is there. You've got Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. There are kidnapping squads. Again, middle of the desert, and we'd spent a whole day traveling. We got government protection to come with us, so we were four cars, 4x4s driving through the desert, and around us we had several other 4x4s with military, with AK-47 that the Niger government had given us as protection as we drive through this very dangerous territory to go film these gold mines. And then on the way back, when we arrived back in cell phone service after being, with no cell phone service for almost 2 days, we came back to the town and we were told that there had been a military coup and that the president was no longer the president. Borders were closed, airspace was closed, and our military convoy and protection were taken away from us. So we were stranded in the middle of one of the most dangerous places on earth, and as targets because we were Westerners. There was a lot of anti-Western feelings at the time, sentiment, and it was incredibly dangerous for us to be there. And we had no way out because, like I said, everything was shut down around us. And so that was incredibly nerve-wracking. And it lasted 9 days, and it was the 9 hardest days of my life.
What's up, guys? Have you guys heard about senolytics? Until recently, I hadn't, but it's a class of ingredients discovered less than 10 years ago, and they're being called the biggest discovery of our time for promoting healthy aging and enhancing your physical prime. So your life goals and your career goals and all that stuff requires productivity. And let's be honest, the aging process is not exactly our friend when it comes to keeping endless amounts of energy and being super productive. So that's why I started to use Qualia Senolytic. So as we age, everyone accumulates what are called senescent cells in their body. So senescent cells cause symptoms of aging, such as aches and discomfort, slow workout recoveries, and sluggish mental and physical energy that's associated with that kind of middle-age feeling. So what Qualia does is it removes those worn-out senescent cells to allow for the rest of them to thrive in the body. Their formula is non-GMO, it's vegan, it's gluten-free, and all the ingredients are meant to complement one another, factoring in the combined effect of all the ingredients together. So I started taking it. I have higher energy levels, I feel more productive, and my body hurts less after workouts too. But don't take my word for it. Try it out for yourself. It's got a 100-day money-back guarantee. So click the link in the description below, or go to qualialife.com/Dalton for up to 50% off, and use code Dalton at checkout for another 15%. That's QUALIA life.com/DALTON and use code Dalton at checkout for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks to Qualia for sponsoring today's episode. Life takes a toll on your body, and one of the first places you feel it is your back. Maybe you tried swapping out your mattress thinking that's the solution. And sure, a good mattress helps, but something I didn't realize is that your bed frame may actually be the problem. So there's an Australian startup called Sleeping Duck. They're founded by aerospace engineers, and they ran some stress tests on beds, and they found something surprising. They discovered that even with good mattresses, the bed frames, which are usually made out of flimsy, lightweight materials, often sag, completely compromising your support. So what they did is they engineered a bed called the Indestruct bed. And they built its core with over 110 pounds of structural grade steel, and they put steel beams under the backs of the sleeper. It's so much more supportive on the back that it became a bestseller in Australia, and now it's finally here in the States. So I really encourage you guys to check it out. Every part is precision engineered, and it comes with sleek designs to fit your space as well. So try it out for yourself. It comes with a 100-day trial. Head over to sleepingduck.com and give it a look. Back to the show. How did you guys end up getting out eventually?
So basically, after 9 days of being stuck in Niger, all the evacuations were happening from the capital, and that was very far from us. There was no way that we could reach the capital. So we were just seeing plane loads of French and English and Germans and Portuguese and Spanish people being evacuated from the country, and yet we had no way of reaching those evacuations. So eventually, my team here in Los Angeles, which was included my husband, working around the clock nonstop to try to figure out a way to get us out. And eventually they found some pilots that were crazy enough to, they found an evacuation company that was actually willing to help us. We'd been talking to one that wasn't very helpful. That's actually part of the show. If you see that episode, you'll see our very frustrating conversations with the initial evacuation company. And then eventually they found this other evacuation company with these pilots that were crazy enough to fly to Niger to pick us up. And the way that it was described to us was that they were going to come in the middle of the night. So we had to be at the airport before dawn because they could sort of come in a more secretive way, and that we had like 20 minutes. The plane was going to be on the ground for 20 minutes. Again, airspace was closed, so there were no planes going in and out of the country, only the evacuation planes coming out of the capital. And so, yeah, it was like middle of the night, be there, 20 minutes to get on the plane, and if you don't get on the plane's leaving without you. And eventually, obviously none of us could sleep that night. And the plane, and interestingly enough, and I have to backtrack a little bit, was when we were trying to figure out a way out, one of the things we did was I went to the airport and I met the manager of the airport. And it was an amazing man. And I asked him, do you know, are there planes coming in and out? Do you know if there's any scheduled planes going or leaving? And he said, actually, right now, there's nothing. And I said, look, do you have kids? And he said, I do. And I said, my son, it's his birthday next week. And I promised him that I would be in the United States at home for his birthday. So if you hear of any planes or anything, here's my number. Please contact me. He was an amazing man. And at the time, I didn't know he was an amazing man, but I sort of deposited my trust in him. And I went back, and then the days continued and nothing was happening. The war was brewing. People were being taken out of the country, but we were not. And eventually the day came when they finally figured out an evacuation plan for us. And we head to the airport, and the plane was delayed, we were told. So the plane that was supposed to arrive at 4 a.m. was now only arriving at like 6:30 a.m. But when we get to the airport that morning, there was military everywhere. And the military was not happy and didn't want us to leave, particularly one guy that kept yelling at us and telling us that we didn't have the right paperwork and why were we leaving the country and planes weren't allowed in, and he didn't want us to leave. So it was one of those like Argo like situations where, we were so close, and yet, this one man could ruin all our plans. And but my friend, the airport manager, was there as well. And he started talking to the man and yelling at the man and trying to help us get out of the country. Eventually, we see the plane and it lands. And it was a crazy situation. I'm on the phone with my husband in the US. And I'm telling him, meanwhile, I have my whole team, and they're all Darren's on the phone with me. They're all communicating. They're all on like a Zoom meeting together. They all have their computers, and they're all seeing this. They're tracking the plane as it's arriving in Agadez, where we are at, and everybody's communicating with each other. Darren's on the phone with me, and I'm telling him, the military is not letting us go. I don't know what to do. And Darren realizes that on the flight list, the names of the pilots are there, and he realizes that they're actually Portuguese names. And he says, hey, Mariana, I think they're Portuguese. I think the pilots are Portuguese. And I see the plane lands, pilot starts coming out of the plane, walking towards us, and the military guy who's there yelling. And I ran to the pilot and I asked him, are you Portuguese? And he says, yes. And I started talking to him in Portuguese. So the military guy is arriving, but I'm at this point speaking in Portuguese, so he can't understand. And I'm telling the pilot, look, he's giving us a hard time because one of our guys who's from Mali, he was our fixer at the time with us, he doesn't have the visa to go to Dubai, which was our next destination, was the closest and safest place for us to travel to. And he doesn't have a visa. So this guy first doesn't want us to let us go. Now he's saying he will let us go, but will not let a team member of ours go. And I'm not leaving the country without him. And I'm saying all this in Portuguese. And I was like, I promise to God, if you take us, that at some point during the flight, he's going to get his visa. Just whatever in Portuguese, all of this in Portuguese. Let us go, let us go. And the pilot was amazing and stuck his neck out for us and told the military guy, I'm sorry, but I'm taking everyone with me, and really stood by us. Eventually, I remember my whole team is already on the plane. I'm like running. I'm the last one. I'm running towards the plane. And Kader, my manager, airport manager friend, yells at me, Mariana, Mariana. And I look back and he says, say happy birthday to your son. And it was a real incredible moment. And I walked on the plane, and yeah, it was like a big, huge sigh of relief for everyone. We'd been just living through hell. I was getting phone calls from the family members of my team members, from the wives and the parents, telling us how worried they were. My husband wasn't sleeping. My father wasn't sleeping. I mean, all these people that we were worrying. So I think the worst thing was more than just like the fact that we were nervous about our own situation, was what our families were going through. And I just felt this enormous responsibility for my whole team, and the feeling that I'd placed them in this situation. So if anything happened to them, it was my fault. So being on that plane was just a huge sigh of relief. The cameras, they were filming me, and I couldn't stop crying. And I also felt really, really sad for the incredible people we'd met that whole time in Niger. Really brave souls, incredible, beautiful people. Some of them who had, actively helped us get out of the country. And for them, their future was fucked. It was progressing. There was development in the country. A lot of that development was paid by American money, Western money, and suddenly they were going backwards. And it just felt like a really sad situation for the whole country. So it all crumbled that moment, and I could not stop crying for almost the whole trip.
Yeah, no, I remember at the end of it, like getting on the plane, you just really let it go. But that was like just relief and kind of just all this built up emotion that you're just.
I'd been, playing the brave person up until that moment. You don't want to show any weakness. You want to show the people back home that you're okay, that everything is okay. You want to show your team members. As the person in charge in that situation, I wanted to show them that I wasn't scared, because the moment I show them, that I'm scared, it'll make them scared too. So I have to keep telling them, we're going to get out of here, we're going to get out of there, even though I wasn't sure that if we were. So yeah, it was just like, and then also the idea, like I was finally going to see my son, and that was an amazing moment.
So, would you say that was probably the closest call?
It was the most uncertain that I've ever felt. I think I've been in, it was a dangerous situation for sure, but I've been in situations with the Sinaloa cartel where, shots have been fired and we were in very close proximity to death. And in this situation, yes, there were terrorist organizations around us. We were a possible target. But more than that, it was just the uncertainty of not knowing when we were going to be able to leave the country, and the situation was not under our control whatsoever. And that felt really, really awful. I'm not a nervous or anxious person in general. I don't have insomnia. I sleep really well. I'm usually never anxious, and I did not sleep at all those days. And I remember calling my husband at the end in the middle of the night, because the cell phone service was shitty during the day, but at night, because people weren't using the cell phone system, it was the best time to actually be able to make phone calls. So I remember, at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., just being on the phone with my team back in LA and with my husband. And just like trying to close my eyes and sleep and not being able to, and just the worry, it was just awful. But yeah, happy it was all.
Yeah. Wasn't that coup, like, I don't know if this was just like speculation, but wasn't that, so I think that was just not too far after Tony Blinken had gone there for the first time.
Yeah, that's right.
And the U.S. was providing aid. And I think that, I don't know, again, I don't know if it's news or if it was speculated on, that Putin kind of pushed this into action, because if there was a coup and the U.S., essentially as soon as the U.S. had to call it a coup, they had to cease funding to that region. And basically they would swoop right into the arms of Putin.
That's why Americans weren't evacuated. One of the biggest American drone bases in the world is actually in Niger, just outside of Agadez, where we were. And we were in communication with the military at the time. And we asked them, when the military protection we had abandoned us, we basically got in touch with them and asked them, can we come into the base? Because at least we'll be behind, we'll be protected. And they weren't able to, and for a few reasons we were later told, but one of them was because the United States hadn't officially called it a coup, because the moment they did, they would have to, they'd spent millions of dollars investment in building these bases. There were 2 big bases, American bases in Niger, all of them to try to fight against terrorism, the exact story that we were there to tell. So we were caught in the middle of our own story. And so they weren't able to help us at the time. There were also concerns about one of the members of our teams being from Mali. So we had told them from the start that in order to help us, they had to help the whole team because, at least one person in the team wasn't actually an American citizen, but we wanted them to take us all. And they were not, they didn't feel safe with that situation. So they didn't save us. They didn't help us at all whatsoever.
Well, I respect you guys saying it's all of us or none of us, especially because like your fixer is kind of like you can't really do the story without him. Yeah.
It's the unsung hero. There you go again. This is why we depend heavily on them to do the stories we tell. And then I think it is our responsibility to make sure that we treat them exactly like we do any other of our team members, because they are. In many situations, they are the people keeping us safe. They're the people that share their stories with us. And I always follow the directions of the fixers when on the ground, or always try to, because they know better than all of us.
And I was thinking, you told me a story last night when you were talking about like calling Darren back home. You told me a funny one about like kind of how he supports you in the relationship.
Yeah.
If you could tell that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started journalism, essentially traveling around the world with my husband, Darren. And I think we're basically cut from the same cloth. We both are incredibly curious people. We love traveling around the world. We've always been fascinated by black markets and the underworld. And so having done stories about the opiate crisis with him before, when I was finally in a position to film inside a fentanyl lab, I met with the cartel and they told me, and Darren wasn't there at that time, I was in Sinaloa, and they told me, okay, we'll give you access to a lab, but we'll come get you in the middle of the night. We'll have to blindfold you and your team members, and we're going to take you to a place you have no idea where it is. I can't tell you how far it is from the city, but you'll be able to film. And I called my husband and told him, this is a little crazy. I'm not sure. What do you think? Thinking maybe he would tell me, absolutely crazy, you're not going to do this. And instead, his words were, make sure that the team is filming you when the cartel is blindfolding you. And I love that, because it sort of speaks a lot to our relationship and, to the stuff that we love to do.
So what can you say about that one? Like, there's a lot of people that watch the show that are married or in a relationship, and you guys have been together since, you said you met in film school. You've been together a long time, and as you've said, you spend half your time on the road. So like, what would you say? Like, it's kind of cliche to ask for like a secret, but what would you say is like, what advice would you give to people about marriage?
I think that doing what you love and sharing what you love with the person you love really, really helps in our relationship, at least. I spent a lot of my time on the road without him. We have a child, we have a son, and there has been he's my number one supporter. He knows exactly what I'm going through when I'm in the field. He knows if I'm not calling him, why I'm not calling him. He understands my drive, because he shares that drive with me as well. And I think that really, really helps. So when it's him, when he's out there traveling, I understand it as well. So there's no expectation of, why aren't you calling home every day? Why aren't you, why aren't you staying home? We're both incredibly passionate about the work we do. And it's pretty awesome. We spend the vast majority of our time, it's basically 50-50. Oh, actually, it's more like 20-80. 20% talking about work. It used to be 100% talking about work, and now it's 80% talking about our son, which is what you do when you have a child. But yeah, we spend all our time either talking about work or talking about the person we love most in the world.
So somebody who gets it.
Oh my God, somebody who totally gets it. Yeah, he's my number one supporter. It's pretty incredible, to share this drive and this passion with someone.
So like, are you familiar with Sean Langan?
No.
He's a documentarian, and he's worked for the BBC primarily and Channel 4 in the UK over the years. and he's a war correspondent. He used to do stories about like Islamic extremists and the Taliban, but they used to, like, as a common practice, when they'd pick him up, they'd blindfold him, and like just to show, like, just to not be able for him to not be able to tell like where they were going to kind of protect their trade craft.
Right.
And one time, again, he's like, yeah, sure, blindfold me, no problem. And one time they actually, like the Taliban actually kidnapped him and held him for 3 months. And he told that story in here. But I'm just like, when you deal with the cartels and some of these people, do they not ask to do things like that frequently?
So it's different. The cartel is guided by profit, right? So they don't do anything that hurts their business. So kidnapping American journalists is going to hurt their business. It is different from an ideological war, which is what the terrorist organizations are waging against the West. So when they're kidnapping a foreigner, they're doing that through, obviously financial also. They also want to make money out of it, and that's why they also, ask for a lot of money in return. But they do it also. They don't see it as hurting their business, right? Their image is tarnished enough that there's not much that they can do to tarnish their image. So it's different. So I'm not sure that I would feel okay with being blindfolded by a terrorist organization. I have dealt with terrorist organizations. I've interviewed terrorist members, but I think it would be a different equation if I was calling my husband and telling him, like, ISIS wants to blindfold me and take me into their territory. I don't think he would be okay with that. But there's an understanding when you're working with the cartel that it is not in their interest to harm American journalists. That is not the case with Mexican journalists. I mean, being a journalist in Mexico is one of the most dangerous professions in the world. Journalists are killed almost on a daily basis in Mexico. It's incredibly dangerous. And this is why I respect journalists so much around the world, particularly those that are reporting in dangerous places like Mexico.
And Miguelito, shout out to Miguelito.
Miguelito.
With those
Miguel.
big balls.
Yeah,
and your big ovaries, as you say, right?
Ovaries in my case and balls in his case. He's an incredible human being, incredibly brave. I mean, one of his best friends, who was a journalist also at the newspaper where Miguel worked at, was killed, by the cartel because of the reporting that he'd been doing. So again, I cannot state enough how heroic the work that journalists in Mexico do. So when people say like that I'm very brave for doing what I do, I'm not. The brave people are the people that are living in those countries. Again, because I have the privilege of coming back to the United States. And a lot of the people that I spend time with, that I work with, don't. And those are really the brave souls.
Well, you're being humble because you and the team are brave. And it's just thinking about Pete driving away slowly on the back of the quad.
Poor Pete.
Yeah.
Poor Pete.
I did it for the story, baby.
I still kill myself for that.
Oh man. So what work have you done on terror?
So yeah, I mean, one of the first stories I ever did was a story that I did on the Syrian-Iraqi border, and it was basically working with people who were fighting against Americans. A lot of them were Al-Qaeda friendly, and I believe a lot of them then joined Al-Qaeda. This was the beginning of, or what we knew as Al-Qaeda. It was right after 9/11. This region eventually became a hub for ISIS. I know that a lot of the people that we spent time with eventually joined ISIS. It wouldn't shock me if they did. I'm quite sure they did. They were, friendly to Al Qaeda back then, and I'm quite sure they became friendly to ISIS after that. I've interviewed ISIS members in Holland, in Antwerp, in the Netherlands. I interviewed a man who had flown to Iraq to join ISIS, and who told me he grew up as an altar boy, actually, Christian altar boy, and had joined ISIS and then was caught by the authorities as he was trying to make his way back to the Netherlands, I believe, and, confronted him with some of ISIS beliefs and asked him, and he stood his ground and his beliefs that were insane. And I also did a story about oil for season 3 of Trafficked, which was how oil is benefiting terrorist groups around the world, including Boko Haram in Nigeria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I've extensively reported. And actually, that was the story I was doing in Niger as well. It was about gold trafficking and how it was benefiting terrorist organizations. And I interviewed a former Al-Qaeda terrorist for that as well.
So when did you interview the ISIS guy in Holland?
That was for a story I did about extremism in Europe, 2015,
Oh,
I
okay.
think, around there. It was, 10 years ago. And it was a look at how extremism on both sides, both right-wing extremism and terrorism, extremism was sort of growing in Europe. And we've seen it happening till this day.
Well, ISIS's brand of extremism is far more extreme than a lot of other groups. Like, did you find that to be the case when you were talking to that person?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a person who believes that gay people should be killed, stoned to death, and he openly said it. A person who believes that the women's role is at home taking care of family members. I remember interviewing an imam in the streets of London who basically told me that he didn't understand how my husband was okay with the fact that I was traveling and leaving my family at home. And this is a well-regarded imam in London. So yes, absolutely. I don't, I don't agree with any of those beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, and for the record, the things that you mentioned are pretty light for the things that they do.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to go too dark, but I mean, if people have seen some of the other stuff that I've had with Americans, like they do some horrific things. And like, again, there's a line between like people that want to live under Sharia law is one thing, but like when groups are too radical for even people like Osama bin Laden, or like if Al-Qaeda calls you too radical and they don't want to be associated with you, like that's the nature of ISIS.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
They're animals.
Yeah, and I would go back that it has nothing to do with religion, right? Again, it's not because everyone who believes in Islam is bad or because Islam is bad. It is about extremism. So any religion that is taken to the extreme can be distorted and turned into a violent religion. It has nothing to do with Islam. So when I was talking about that imam, he held some very extremist beliefs. But that's not the case. I've spent time with a lot of other imams who had incredible, points of view about the world and who were big, huge advocates of peace. And in fact, one of the things people always say about Islam is that the core message of Islam is peace. But like any religion, it can be distorted and it can lead to violence, which is unfortunately what's happened with many of these terrorist organizations.
So isn't Holland too, like aren't there parts of Holland that are starting to kind of like resemble narco states, like with the stuff going on there?
So there's areas and neighborhoods all throughout Europe where there's where their drug trafficking is intense. We did a story about MDMA in the Netherlands. Did you watch that episode?
I did, yeah.
There's huge swaths of the country that have become very similar to a narco state, much like Sinaloa, and that was really intense for me, having grown up in Europe, to report on. Judges are being killed. There's a journalist, one of the most high-profile crime journalists in the Netherlands, who was killed because of the reporting that he was doing. And I think that's really, really dangerous. Once you start silencing people and institutions, that can mean the end of a democracy, particularly when the people that are being targeted are journalists, because the journalists are the ones who are out there reporting on the ills of society, on the failures of government. And if they are being silenced, then there's nobody else out there that's going to be able to speak to that failure. So that is really, really dangerous. And that's where it really scared me to do those stories and see that this is happening in Europe as well.
Yeah. And when you guys were there, wasn't there some like pretty shocking things that they found, like those
the torture chambers and it is eerily reminiscent of what stories I've heard in Sinaloa all my life. I mean, again, torture chambers where they were torturing people that they thought were betraying the cartel or that weren't cooperating with them. There are images that law enforcement got of these torture chambers. I mean, really awful tactics that are, again, very reminiscent of tactics employed by the cartel in Mexico. But this is happening at the heart of Europe.
And then back to you mentioned the oil story that you guys did, and there's and I think we've mentioned like Boko Haram so far, but there was did you go Was it in Iran when you were doing the piece on Hezbollah?
I wish it was in Iran. I'd been trying to film in Iran for the longest time and have never been able to. It was in Lebanon. We went all throughout the country to report on the smuggling of oil that comes from Iran. So it's Iranian oil, but it goes through Lebanon. And it basically, Hezbollah is making a lot of money from it. And at the time, a lot of the oil was being smuggled into Syria as well to prop up the Assad regime.
Yeah. I mean, it's no secret that Iran is like a big state sponsor of terror. And you're talking about groups that target Americans and have plans to do so. And
Absolutely. I mean, for many years, Hezbollah it's still on the list of terrorist organizations by the U.S. State Department, but it's also considered by many years. It killed more Americans. Until 9/11, it was the number one organization that killed more Americans than any other terrorist organization. And it has an enormous power in that part of the world. It is enormous influence. It is part of the government in Lebanon right now, so it's grown exponentially since I started reporting on them many years ago. And to see the flow of oil going all the way to the Assad regime in Syria was also really fascinating.
And again, I think that's a perfect example of like the way the episodes are, because like at one point you're talking to it's like some like clean cut guy that they've appointed to speak on behalf of Hezbollah, and he's like, no, none of this stuff's happening. Like this is, we took this one oil shipment from Iran once, and this is, this has been ceased, and it's nonsense. And then it's like cut to the next scene. You guys are riding in a freaking oil truck.
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, we spent a whole night going back and forth, seeing all of these trucks going across the border into Syria with no one stopping them, carrying loads and loads of oil. We were inside one of these trucks with one of the drivers telling us how he does this almost on a nightly basis. So we're seeing the flow of illegal oil, Iranian oil, into going from Lebanon to Syria. And then I'm sitting across a table from a clean-cut guy in a suit, asking him, and he's denying that this is happening when I just seen it. Yeah.
It's pretty shocking.
Yeah, it is.
So, okay, I know people want to hear about this. So just to wrap up on sort of like the cartel piece, can you talk about the work that you guys did, or the piece that you did on the migrant smuggling?
Yeah.
And how that works?
Yeah, so one of the first stories I ever did in the United States, or for an American organization, news organization, was about migrants. And it was about the death train, which is el Tren de la Muerte. It's a train that carries migrants from southern Mexico all the way to the border with the United States. And at the time I did this story, it was 2006, 2005, 4 or 5. So it was essentially 20 years ago. And the biggest hurdle and danger to the migrants that were trying to make it to the United States was, in fact, that train. I mean, it's a cargo train. People are holding on to the sides of the train or riding on the top of the train. They're falling off. They're, falling asleep. It's days on end and being amputated and dying, and it's these horrible stories. And there was cartel presence back then, and particularly for women, it was really dangerous because cartel members would come and would threaten them and rape them and take all their money. So these stories that we heard again and again, we were following a group of migrants as they were making this dangerous journey. But 20 years later, here I was last year doing the story about migrants, and it had completely changed. The town where we reported initially, where the beginning of that death train was, is Tapachula in southern Mexico. And the town has completely changed, where the train is no longer running, and instead it is the cartel that essentially has taken over the business of smuggling migrants. So for us, it became a business story. We realized that the migrant smuggling story was now a business story. And we got access to King Coyote, as he's known. He's one of the biggest smugglers, or he says himself that he's one of the biggest human smugglers in Mexico. And he runs a massive operation where he charges each migrant between $10,000 and $12,000 to make the journey to the United States, from Central America to the United States. His clients, as he calls them, come from all over the world. He is from India, the Middle East, Africa, all over the world, and they come through, Central America and through Mexico to make it to the U.S. And he told us, and he's carrying 100 to 150 migrants every week, charging them $12,000 each. So it's millions of dollars that he's making every single week. And so it's a huge business. He has a finance department. He has a human resources department. He has lawyers working for him in the United States, tracking every change in law so that he knows when it's best to cross people over. He has eyes on Border Patrol. I mean, it was insane what we were able to find.
It's nuts. And
it's nuts.
And they're paying off those border agents too, right?
I mean, yes, he talked about corruption as well. Yes. I mean, this is not to say I don't want this to be, I think, the vast majority of border agents are heroes. They're working and risking their lives working on the border every single day. But there is corruption in, every single agency in America, in the world, and we've heard in all my reporting, I've heard extensively about corruption in all sort of law enforcement agencies, including Border Patrol.
Yeah, there's bad apples in every bunch.
Exactly.
But so how are they actually doing it? Because I remember that story came out, like the one about there was like, I think 50 dead migrants in like a big 18-wheeler cargo truck that they found. Like, how are they actually bringing them over the border into America?
So a lot of them, they're coming, we were actually with some migrants as we see them doing sort of the last journey into the United States, and they don't come through legal ports of entry. Unlike the drugs, they actually come across illegally. And a lot of times when it comes to Central Americans coming from places like Haiti or Venezuela, the idea is that they're going to give themselves up to the authorities and ask for asylum. So it's as easy as that, or as difficult as that, because a lot of them, actually, I think it's almost 1,000 migrants die every year trying to make this journey, just crossing the border into the United States, which is, if you think, a lot of people dying needlessly. But one interesting thing that I learned while doing that story was that once they cross the border, if their intention is not to give themselves up to the authorities and claim asylum, all the others that are Mexicans, for example, who can't so easily claim asylum, or from other countries, that they want to get, they don't want to, that there's all these checkpoints. The checkpoints don't stop at the border. There's checkpoints right after the border if you're trying to make your way north. So for the vast majority of people who are trying to make it to Los Angeles or to Chicago or New York or the big cities, they have to be able to go through those checkpoints as well. And that's where Americans come in, because a lot of Americans, and it turned out that it was a lot of American students who were trying to make an easy buck, and the cartel would pay them to transport those migrants in their cars all the time. It was really fascinating to see that. It's a part of the trade that I didn't know was happening.
Weren't they putting ads out on
yes,
TikTok?
TikTok. Openly. And we were trying, we saw the TikTok ads, and we actually met with some of those people on that were putting out those TikTok ads. Unfortunately, we weren't able to convince them to talk to us. We tried, and we met them. And I didn't meet them, my producer did at the time. And it was really fascinating. And they talked to them, but we weren't able to get that access. But yeah, they openly say what they were doing. Do you wanna ride from right from the border up to Austin or Houston or wherever they were going, or Los Angeles? Hit me up.
Oh my God! Because I remember. There's one point where you go to like a stash house where like the migrants are waiting, and one guy's waiting for his like sister to pay for him to be released or something. And there was orange like sound panels all over the walls, which is, do you know why that was?
Yes, I do.
Why is that?
It had something to do with the location that we can't disclose, but it had something to do with the location where they agreed to meet us. And with what it was used for. But it wasn't relevant to the story itself. And plus, in order to get this access, we very often cannot disclose the location. But that was one of the most chilling moments we've ever filmed, actually, because we were seeing in real time what was happening. We got to this room, we weren't sure what to expect. We get there, and there's like a dozen migrants who are on their last step of the journey, about to make it to the United States, but it's a point where they have to pay the remaining amount of money. Actually, the last money that's being given to the cartel is once they cross the border, but this is the before last payment that's made. And so the cartel was waiting for the money, and they'd receive the money from everyone except for this one guy. And we were there when he makes the phone call to the sister, who's a farm worker in the United States, and says, "Hey, you still have to pay me the $3,000 or else you're not going to see your brother." And, if you read between the lines, what she means is, they have no intentions of letting this brother go. Not only not make it into the United States, but who knows what ultimately is going to happen to him. So it was really chilling to be in the room at the time. And yeah, I asked him all sorts of questions. Are you really willing to hurt this person? What does it say about you that you're willing to do this? And yeah, it was a shocking moment.
So like the reason for the sound panels, was that like, is it like
it had nothing to do with the business that they were doing?
I was going to say, is it a dark reason, or is it just like a place that would have them?
It was a place that would have them before. So it actually had nothing to do with the migrant smuggling business.
Interesting. Now I'm just thinking about the kind of places that have those. Maybe it was a podcast studio.
Are you running an operation there, Dalton? I think it's you.
We'll cut that out. Just kidding. So, and one thing didn't I hear you say, this is, again, going back to terror, we already talked about this, but didn't I hear you say, I don't remember where it was, that you're trying to do a story on dirty bombs?
Oh, yeah. We did try to do a story about dirty bombs many years ago and ended up not being able to. It wasn't a big deal. It was because we were going to visit a country, and we were told that the authorities had been warned that we were going to visit the country, and they weren't happy. They wouldn't be happy with our presence there. And so it was logistically very difficult for us to tell that story. So we ended up not doing it.
Middle Eastern country?
No. It wasn't the Middle East. I want to protect the journalists that were there, that were helping us. So I don't think I've ever. Yeah. So it's better if we.
Sure.
Yeah, but it wasn't Middle East.
Can you say who the group was that was trying to get their hands on this stuff?
I don't think we went that far, but essentially the idea. I mean, everyone is. Every terrorist organization out there is trying to get their hands on dirty bombs. I think the point of our story was we were trying to see how easy it was to gain access to dirty bombs if you really wanted to. But then it was just like it became logistically very complicated and sort of dangerous. I mean, we were warned against it by our fixers and the people helping us, who ultimately are the ones who would share the biggest brunt of the danger. So we ended up not doing it.
And for people that aren't familiar, like what a dirty bomb is, it's just like basically radioactive material combined with explosives so that when it detonates, it pushes it into the air and contaminates it. But were you guys planning, again, full supply chain, were you planning on going to the sites where they get these radioactive like a Chernobyl or something?
That was the goal. It was actually, Chernobyl was one of the places we were going to visit. There's tour groups, underground tour groups that take tourists to Chernobyl. And we had the director and the producer had actually been and seen they'd been on the outskirts and had seen how it's done in a scout trip that they had done for us to then go. So that was one of the places, yeah.
Yeah, because they have I don't know, I mean, there's certain places that are still hotspots and aren't safe, but I've seen those like tour groups. There's some tours that are like technically like the radiation is not high enough to harm you, right? Like, can't you go certain places that are okay?
Yeah. So I actually reported from Fukushima after the disaster. And the story we were doing was for Explorer, National Geographic at the time, was to see what the Japanese government was doing to try to revive and make Fukushima a safe place for residents to come back. Because everybody had left, obviously. And we had a little radiation meter reading radiation. We went really close to the disaster area. We had to wear our suits and masks and everything and constantly checking for radiation. It was a really fun story to do. I mean, one of the things that we were trying to film was that there were these wild boars that had become radioactive because they were eating, from the forests that were radioactive. And so the government was paying these like freelance hunters to go out there and kill these wild boars. radioactive bores. And we saw one of them being shot. It was really sad. And then we spent time with a mob boss who had lost his arm I think it was in a mob attack. He was a Yakuza member, essentially. And he was single-handedly, he had come back and he was trying to clear his yard he had what do you call those, excavator, with his one arm that he was going around every day and trying to excavate the radiation out. And it was a really fun day spending time with the Yakuza boss.
One-armed Yakuza boss. You guys certainly meet some characters.
Oh my God! And this guy didn't speak a word of English. And at one point, he had a really fast Lexus that he was so proud. It was his pride and joy that he had bought for hundreds of $1,000s because of taxes. In Japan, and he was riding it around. It was like a really fast car. He had modified it, and he was riding around. We were filming him, and then he asked if I want to go in the fast car, and I said sure. And the director thought it was a really great shot to have me and the Yakuza boss ride around town with it. But then he basically doesn't speak Japanese, and I realized that we're not turning around and going back, and he's taking me somewhere. And this one-armed guy who's like, taking me to an undisclosed location. And then finally and I'm like trying to ask him, where are we going? And we can't communicate. And eventually we get to this like government looking building, and he gets out of the car and I was like, what the fuck is happening? And he's like calling somebody, and a friend of his apparently comes down from the building, and he asks his friend to take a photo of me and him in front of the car. So all of that was so that he could take a photo with this blonde American journalist outside of his car. It was like, oh, that's what you're trying to do. And then he owned a sake bar, and we ended the day doing shots of sake at his bar.
Oh my gosh.
It's just a regular day.
The picture's probably on Instagram somewhere.
Yeah, that absolutely is. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Have you guys thought about doing any stories on like Japanese organized crime? I'm not too familiar with them at all.
Yeah, it's really hard to penetrate, really hard to get access to. I've always loved to. We were doing a story about street racing, and there was another story that had something to do where we found some sort of Yakuza connection, and we were trying to get access, but it's really, really hard. It's still on the wish list.
What else is on the wish list that has like really hard access that you're working on, if you can say?
I really want to do a story on piracy.
Like in Somalia?
Yeah, in Somalia. We have some good inroads there. El Tren de Aragua, which is like the new sort of criminal group that is causing havoc here in the United States. We've been trying to gain access to them as well. The world of black markets is endless. So people think, isn't it a finite market? How do you keep doing seasons after seasons about this? But it's actually, I've got a long list of stories that I still want to tell.
Yeah. Was it like 30% of the world's marketplace or something, right?
38%. It's economists believe it's what they call the hidden third, are all these black and gray markets.
And what I've heard of that group, Tren de Aragua, are they cartel affiliated or?
It's a group that started basically in Venezuela, and that has since grown to everywhere and all over Latin America, including Brazil, everywhere, and that has expanded. It's made its way here to the United States. So yeah, it's operating pretty much like a cartel.
I thought I read something or saw something about them being like a bunch of these people in like apartment complexes or like hotels that they took over or something. Is that right?
Yeah, they were. I believe they were involved in some robberies as well, and going around and basically going into these American cities. And I don't know enough about it, but and I'll sound like an idiot as somebody because I don't know enough about it. But I think once if we do get an access to them, then I'll come back and talk to you about it.
I mean, first of all, I don't think people like you'd speak on such a wide variety of subjects. Like it would be impossible, even doing the episodes. Like, sure, it's your work and you live through it, but like to remember all of it and just be able to talk about all of it, I don't think people are going to think you're misinformed.
Thank you.
So, is there anything else like that I missed as far as like anything cartel related that stands out that you'd want to talk about before we move into some of the U.S. based stuff?
I don't think so. But if I remember something, I'll bring it up.
Okay, moving into inside the U.S. at least for now until we branch out otherwise. But there was one episode you guys did on gangs in the U.S. where you're riding around with, I think it was the Crips in L.A. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
We hung out with the Bloods and the Crips in L.A. actually, and there was one scene that we filmed that had both the Bloods and a Crips member, both of them in the front seat of a car, and it was partly because they found a business opportunity where they could work together and make money. And ultimately, it's all about making money. So, yeah. I mean, I think what was, for us, it started by being just a story about gangs, and we wanted to understand how they operate, how they make their money. And it's the OGs of American crime, right? It's like when people think about crime in cities, in urban cities, they think about gangs. And so we wanted to understand how they operate. But then very early in our investigation, we realized that the vast majority, because in order to be able to run a gang, you need new recruits all the time. You need people who start at the bottom, who then want to make their way up. But you need to constantly get fresh blood, essentially. And I realized early on that a lot of that new fresh blood were new immigrants that would come into the country. And a lot of them were then got in trouble, were deported to their countries of origin, and would then start gangs there, would create, violence and chaos in those countries, which would create more immigration. So it's sort of like a full circle, right? It's gangs in America being deported, bringing their violence and their tactics to these other countries that then makes people want to leave that country because of violence, brings new immigrants that bolsters these gangs. So it's a full circle of violence. And that became sort of a thesis of our investigation. And then that's why we ended up in Belize, because now Belize has a huge problem with violence. They didn't have it a few years ago, and it's essentially all because of the Bloods and the Crips. They actually have those gangs with those names in Belize as something that didn't exist, and it was an American import.
And so, I think it's a well-known thing that in that gang life, you're either going to end up dead or in jail, right? And going back to that, dig in the trench concept, do they think that they're smarter than the last guy and it won't happen to me? And
yeah, I also think that they, live young, die young. I think they think that it's if you grow up in a community where all the heroes are gang leaders and they're the ones who are making money and being able to provide for your family, that's what you're going to want to do as well. Those are the role models, unfortunately, in many neighborhoods across America and many places around the world. And, I spent time with pimps as well. I did a story for season 1 about pimps. And I think one of the most eye-opening interviews we've ever done was with a pimp, where I was asking him, how do you do what you do to women? And he openly talked about being violent towards women. And he said, look, Matt, your heroes maybe were, presidents and politicians or lawyers or doctors. My heroes growing up were the pimps and the drug traffickers and the gang members. So if you ask any kid in my neighborhood what they want to do when they grow up, they want to be pimps and gang leaders and drug traffickers, drug dealers. And so which is why, my job as a journalist, I see it very much as trying to understand the motivations. Again, to me, it's much more important to understand why a person becomes a gang member than it is to criticize what they do. And really, understanding the motivations. So, yeah.
So let's talk about that pimps one, because I had Jeff Teagues in here. I don't know if you know that name by chance. Do you?
No.
Okay.
I just didn't want to say no to another one.
No. And again, they're not big names that I'm throwing at you like you should know. But it's he basically he was in the military. He was another Delta Force operator, and he got out and he started this anti-sex trafficking organization, which is a nonprofit, and they combat these traffickers here in America. And he really enlightened me and us on a pimp is a trafficker. Because I went into it with the conception that or the misconception rather, that the girls out there on the street selling their bodies are doing it 9 out of 10 times on their own volition. They may have a pimp, but nobody's forcing them to do that. That's their choice. But what he said is that's not the case at all. Like they have pimps, but again, like the way that sex trafficking is spelled out in the law here in America is force, fraud, or coercion. And like again, you take something like coercion, like you're telling me that not every single pimp has a moment where he has to persuade a girl that doesn't want to go out there and sell her body to do that. But again, they do way worse shit than that. And there was a guy that you talked to that told you guys something pretty horrific that he did to his girl. It wasn't just persuasion. If you want to talk about that.
Yeah, it was one of this girls, one of his girls who tried to escape, and when he found her, he basically cut the soles of her feet with a razor blade as a warning to, if you do this again, it will get worse. And it was a warning to all the girls that he had working for him. He was the pimp that I asked the question about why you do what you do, and who told me the story about growing up, looking up as pimps as his heroes. And yes, it is true. I've reported on sex trafficking extensively. It is true that the vast majority of the women on Figueroa Street, which is a big center for it's the Blade in LA, a center for prostitution, and every big city has one, that a lot of them have pimps. But it is also true, I've reported on the escort industry, and it is also true that there are a lot of women who prostitute themselves from their own free will because this is what they want to do. And I think sometimes the conversation gets muddled in a belief that any woman who wants to sell their body has to be doing that because they're being forced to. And that's not the case. There are women who want to do it, who want to be escorts, who want to sell their bodies because that is what they want to do. And I think it's just as somebody who's reported on sex trafficking, it's an interesting place to see it from that mindset too. But however, it's, that doesn't take away any of the horrible things that are being done by pimps. And the vast majority of women, when they're out on the streets, what the pimps offer them is they offer them protection. It's really dangerous to be out there in the middle of the night on the streets by yourself. So what pimps come in is they tell them, give me part of your money and I'll protect you. Often what happens is that they actually take away all your money, and they are the ones who are going to, hurt you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny, that guy that mentioned cutting the bottom of the girl's feet, he justifies it by saying, oh, there's pimps out here that are doing way worse stuff than that. And that may be true, but like again, for me, that one is more black and white. Like the way I'm looking at it right now, like I would rather, I don't know if maybe I'll say this and I'll look back at it in a couple of years and be like, I don't know, dude, or a couple minutes even, but I would rather that American girl bring kilos of fentanyl, like lace drugs, across the border and have misguided Americans make the choice to put that in their body than have the guy that forces people to do things and holds them hostage and tortures them psychologically. Like I give that person more of a pass than that one.
You'd rather be a drug trafficker than a pimp.
Because again, a pimp is a trafficker.
Yeah.
And you say like you've reported on it. Maybe in some cases they're not.
No. Yeah. No, absolutely. A pimp is a sex trafficker, and that was part of our story as well. What I was talking about is that there are women who voluntarily sell their bodies and do it without a pimp. That doesn't mean that when a pimp is involved, what they're doing is they're making money out of somebody else selling their bodies, a lot of times through force, fraud, or coercion, which is the case absolutely the vast majority of times. We can talk about if we had to pick between being drug traffickers or sex traffickers, what would you rather do, knowing that you are directly harming somebody? I think what we can't discount in terms of a drug trafficker is that, every trafficker I have interviewed has always said, I'm not forcing drugs down a person's throat. They're doing it because they want to. However, we're missing out a big piece of the puzzle here, which is the fact that it's addiction. The vast majority of people taking drugs, if they'd had a choice, they wouldn't be taking drugs. It is addiction, and that's what we can't discount. And that's why treatment centers and really, focusing on rehabilitation is important.
So how do you look at it though? Because like your job and like your strength is to be an empath in that situation, but like
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, one of the interviews we did was with an assassin in Los Angeles, and he told me right off the bat he was not easy. I mean, it was impossible to be empathetic to him. He was made me feel uncomfortable. He threatened us. He said that if first thing he says, it was middle of the night, close to downtown LA. He shows me his gun and he said, "If this is a fucking setup, and if the police show up, I'm gonna fucking kill you and your whole crew." That's the first thing he said before we even as we're turning our cameras on. And then the whole time I'm interviewing him, which lasted only like 10, 15 minutes, I'm thinking, if the police shows up, not because we're here, but if they just show up, we're in the middle of a big city. I mean, the police can show up any moment. They can just drive by. We're going to be in serious trouble. So I wanted to make that interview quick. But I mean, he's talking to me about killing people and why he does it and how he does it. And yeah, I think empathy there is really, really, really hard. But then a few weeks later, I was in South Africa speaking to another assassin who was telling me a story about how his parents were killed when he was just a young boy. And he was orphaned and he had no way to fend for himself. And the only way, and he didn't have an education. Again, both parents were killed. And he found his way. The only opportunity he was given was through drug trafficking. And he started working in the drug market. And soon after, he was paid to become a hired assassin, a hitman. And he was saying, but I do not kill women and children. And I do not want to harm women and children. And I asked him, but do you not realize that what you're doing by killing the fathers of those children, you're harming those children, and you're creating more, his name was Jojo, you're creating more Jojos. You're creating more people like you, more orphan kids who will ultimately also perhaps become killers like you. And he said he had never thought about that. He says, I think the way that they justify it in their minds, whether you're a drug trafficker or a pimp or an assassin, is that they're doing what is right, right? And actually, I just did a story about militias, the growth of militias in America and abroad. And one of the justifications that militias have is that they say, that they are doing what is right. But the problem is that the line is very blurred. What is right? What's right for you might not be right for me, right? For Jojo, he thinks he's killing bad people, but who are bad people? And I asked him, are you then a bad person? Should you be killed? And he says, yes, I think I am a bad person. But yeah, it's the justifications that people, find to be able to continue their work. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like that old question. I don't know if it's like a philosophy question or psychology question, but like, would you steal bread to feed your family?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, how much bread are we stealing here?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an easy answer for all of us. When I'm interviewing a kid who's 16, 17 years old, carrying kilos and kilos of cocaine on his backs in the mountains of Peru, and I ask him why he's doing what he's doing when he's seen many of his friends being killed right in front of him. Really dangerous journey to get those drugs to the place where they need to go, that cocaine. And I asked him, and he tells me, look, I've always dreamt of being a dentist, and my family is very, very poor, and I can't afford to go to college. So the only way that I can make enough money to one day become a dentist is by carrying cocaine. And yes, I'm risking my life, and I've seen my friends being killed, but at least I have a chance of reaching my dreams. And if I put myself in the shoes of this young kid, knowing how I am and how I'm ambitious and how I've fought very hard to get where I am today, quite frankly, I think all of us would understand that we would probably be doing the same thing. Yeah.
So the assassin in LA specifically, I remember watching that and I was like, this guy seems like unhinged. Like if it was me and I wanted to hire someone to do that kind of work for me, I would want them to be like more clean cut and polished and smart and like, but what like organization did he work for?
He's a freelance hitman. That's how it was told. And we got to him through a contact that I have in LA who I've, worked with on a bunch of different stories. And you see me, I'm driving with this contact and he tells me that he believes that this guy is the real deal, that he's seen him being paid lots of money to go and do these hits. And he told me, be careful with him, because I think he's like, there's something wrong with him. He can be happy and nice one moment and he loses it the next moment. And so, yeah, I was on edge the whole time. And so was my team.
So like with a guy like that, like when you guys are, it's pretty cut and dry when you're in a meth lab in, Sinaloa with a chemist. Like that's you see them doing that. But like with a guy like that, he's just a dude on the street that's like masked up, and how do you validate that like he is who he says he is?
Through my other contacts, because I've done a lot of stories with this other person, and he's given me access to a lot of underworld, and that's why I wanted to make sure that this guy was, in fact, who he says he is. And quite frankly, we open up that process. We make it very transparent. We interviewed a guy who is involved, or who boasted about being involved in the trafficking of organs in Colombia. A guy calls himself the wrecker, el deshuesador, that means the wrecker in English. And interviewing him, I had serious doubts about whether he was really who he said he was. And a lot of these guys just want to boast, when they say they've killed hundreds of people or they've trafficked X amount of drugs, and it's all bullshit. So we are actually very transparent throughout the reporting about the stuff that we believe in and the stuff we don't. And in that case, I remember asking that guy, you're saying that you're actually killing people, opening them up and taking their organs. Like, that is bullshit. And I asked him, and he showed me videos of people being dissected, and with, he said it was medical staff, and it looked like actually a medical environment. But I said, there is no way that I can actually make sure that this guy is for real. And there isn't. And I make that very clear to our viewers every time that there is doubt or, when reporting on the underworld, it's really hard to fact check. And we want to make that very clear, and I think we do.
But in that case, like, he showed you videos of like organs being removed. Like, what was the context there? Like, where was that for, like, sick people that were on a wait list or something?
Yeah, all around the world, particularly here in America, there's a huge list of I think it's 7 Americans who die every year on an organ wait list, because there aren't enough people supplying. There aren't enough organs out there for the people that are waiting for those organs. So it's a horrible, horrible situation. You'll die without a liver, and that liver never arrives, and you eventually die. And that is happening to 7 Americans every single day. And so there's a real scarcity of organs. And so whenever there's a scarcity of something and somebody's willing to pay high price for it, that's the beginning of a black market. And that black market exists, and it's thriving here in the United States. And those organs are usually coming from the most desperate of desperate people. So we went and tried to figure out, we'd heard rumors that a lot of migrants were willing to offer their organs in exchange for money, so that they could make their way to the United States. So we sort of spent time in some of these areas where there's a lot of migrants making that journey and trying to figure out. And that's where we met the wrecker and interviewed him, and we're trying to sort of gain access to that chain.
So how do they actually do that then? Like, how do they go about like finding people and then like doing, is it like some like makeshift surgery? Like what is the process like?
According to what they told us, they have, and we actually interviewed one of the doctors in Colombia, who told us how it's done. But yes, they usually have the way they told us is that they usually have a request from somewhere, and they then go and find somebody who's willing to donate. In this case, not donate. They buy the organ. Buying an organ in the United States is illegal, and that's, I think Iran is actually one of the only countries in the world where there's a marketplace for organs. And there's a lot of people that say that that's a good thing and that's the way it should be. Other people say that that's actually not the way it should be, because ultimately it's the most desperate people that are going to sell those organs. But at the same time, if you have a donation system like what's happening here in the United States and the vast majority of Western countries, it doesn't work perfectly either, because people are still dying on the wait list. So yeah, I think there's a long discussion to be had on, is a marketplace better than a place where we expect donations to happen?
And so, like, going back to him, like, showing you those, like, grisly videos, it just, like, made me think, like, is there stuff what kind of stuff have you guys gotten that, that you couldn't show?
He showed us a video that was way too gruesome to show our audience, our viewers. Also, it was he told me he could show me, but he didn't want it to be public. But we were trying to figure out if this was actually even possible, if they were actually removing body parts and organs from people. And again, no way, and I make it very clear, there's no way that I could fact check and make sure that that was the case and that his claims were actually real.
But, like, outside of that story specifically, like, have you guys caught things on camera that are, like, way too gruesome or too violent or just extreme to show as part of the show?
No, we just did a story on fentanyl, another story on fentanyl. It's coming out next season, and it's about trank dope. It's basically the fourth wave of the opiate crisis, where fentanyl is now being mixed with other chemicals and creating a crisis in itself, a whole new crisis. Trank dope is essentially when fentanyl is mixed with xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer. What it does that's not safe for human consumption, but it's being mixed in with fentanyl. What it does is that it keeps the high of fentanyl. Fentanyl is a very quick high. It gives you a very high, but a very fast-acting one. And so what xylazine does is that it affects your nervous system, so it prolongs that high. And but what it also does is that it creates these horrific wounds in people. So we were in Kensington, just outside in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we saw it's one street it's the biggest open air market in America. It's a street, I'm sure you've seen footage of this, where you see basically zombies, drug addicts walking up and down the streets. And we filmed the horrific open wounds that looks like leprosy. It's one of the most disturbing things we've ever filmed. And these incredibly brave and generous souls that are working in basically a makeshift clinic that donate their time and their resources in trying to help some of these people and do wound care. And we filmed them doing wound care and removing these. It was just horrible, like bandages full of like pus and blood. And there was a real discussion as to how much of this we should show, because obviously nobody wants to see those wounds. And I think the reaction of the majority of our viewers would be to want to turn off the television and not see any more of it. But at the same time, I think it is our responsibility to show this public health crisis and what is happening to Americans on our streets. And so there was a real debate about it. I think we ended up warning people that we were going to show it, and then we showed it for a little bit, and then we stopped showing it. But images like that will stay with you for the rest of your life, even if you just see them on television, particularly if you see them in real life. I saw them that one day, but there is incredible people that are working on the ground every day to make sure that those people are taken care of. And those are real heroes.
So is it like an injection site wound?
Yeah, it's an injection site
it.
wound, yeah. And then the wounds people have been amputated because of these wounds. And they go to hospitals and to doctors, and they're not treated with respect. That's what they say, that doctors and in hospitals, which is normal too. They say that they think of them as just addicts that are coming here just for pain medication. And so a lot of times they just prefer to go to these harm reduction places where they say they're treated by other people who respect them more, which was the case of what we witnessed there. Yeah, it was really interesting. It's the fourth wave of the fentanyl crisis, and I think there's very little reporting about it. And I'm really excited for this episode to come out because I don't think most Americans know about it.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
So in this case, it's used as to combine it with something else to supply a high.
Yeah.
But the thing that they combine,
polydrugs.
it's like an extended release.
Yeah, it's what's called a polydrug, which is actually very troubling. I mean, you're seeing you're seeing cocaine being mixed with fentanyl. A bunch of people horribly have died from overdoses. They thought they were doing cocaine, and instead there was fentanyl in it. The same with meth. I mean, there's a huge polydrug crisis happening in America right now. In the case of fentanyl, it's that 90% of the supply is now being tainted. I mean, they've analyzed these batches of fentanyl where only 10% of it was actually fentanyl and 90% of it was xylazine. So it's not even that fentanyl is being tainted, is that the vast majority of it is not fentanyl anymore. And the problem with that, as crazy as you think it can't get worse than fentanyl, right? A drug that is so powerful that just, 2 grams of it or 2 grain salts of it will kill you. You think this is it. It can't get worse than that. But the problem with this new poly drug and with xylazine in particular is that if you overdose from it, there's usually, if you've overdosed from an opiate, you have Narcan, and that will revive you. And everybody in these places where there's high levels of drug addiction, people carry, there's Narcan everywhere. We always carry Narcan with us as well. And with the problem with xylazine is that it's not affected by Narcan. So a lot of people are dying and they're, being amputated and carrying these awful wounds. And yet, nobody's really talking about it. It again talks about the failure in addressing this very public health care problem.
So where's this stuff coming from?
Xylazine is, we went down to Mexico because we were trying to figure out where it was being mixed. And some of it is coming from Mexico, but the vast majority of it is actually being mixed. The drug is being mixed here in the United States. And it's drugs that are available for animals, and they're being diverted and being sold for human consumption or mixed in with drugs.
How is it made? Did you guys go see it being made?
No, so it's being sold it's being used by vets on animals and horses. You often refer to as a horse tranquilizer. And it's very, very cheap. And we went to Florida, actually, where we spent time with some people who were at Chili and Cheese, were their names, or the names they gave us. And we saw them basically mixing the xylazine with the fentanyl, and they explained why they were doing it. And it's essentially, it's just because fentanyl is way more expensive than xylazine. If they mix it together, they can make money. And they started, it wasn't their idea. Somebody else started it. And then they realized, people actually like this. So let's start selling our dope mixed in with xylazine because it prolongs the high, and it actually is cheaper for us anyway. So it's for them a no-brainer.
Well, that's what I meant. Like how are they making the poly drug? Is it like a lab process, or they just crude
throw it together? In this case, they just mix the two together. Fentanyl is very, very difficult to make, and it really takes chemistry. It's incredibly dangerous as well because it is so potent, and we saw that in the fentanyl lab. But then once it's made, the mixing it with other drugs is usually quite easy. I think the bigger and a question that we haven't been able to answer, and we tried on that story actually, was trying to figure out why is fentanyl being mixed with drugs like cocaine and even weed. I mean, there were weed cartridges that are being sold that people think they're smoking weed, and in fact, there was fentanyl in it. Ecstasy, there was a high school close to my son's high school in Los Angeles, where some kids thought they were taking ecstasy, MDMA, and in fact, it was laced with fentanyl. So we were trying to figure out, is it purposely put into those supply chains, or is it a mistake? And nobody has been able to really answer. I think what we've been told is when you have drug trafficking groups and they're all just mixing all the drugs, that even if you just put a little fentanyl in there for somebody who has not built any tolerance, they can overdose immediately, and it's basically from the dirty mixing of it all, and it's not purposely being done. On the other hand, I've also heard other people say that actually, if you put a little fentanyl, the hope is that the person won't die, but they'll become addicted to something that is way more addictive than cocaine or weed.
Yeah, and how about that guy, the cartel chemist that was cooking up the fentanyl in the episode? Like I think he had some sort of engineering degree, but he was saying how they put, horse lidocaine into the mix as in like an anesthesia, so that, to your point, like people get high, but they don't become a zombie, so they keep coming back.
Yeah, it's incredible, right? I mean, you see how, this is the thing that I find from so many of these guys that you talk to, is that given the chance, these are brilliant minds. I mean, obviously, you don't condone what they do. I do not condone what they do. It's horrible. But you see this sort of their enterprising mind, and how they're really good at doing what they do. And if they were on the right side of the law, they can actually be incredible contributors to society. But because this is the world they grew up in, they're using all those skills and talent in a really awful way. But the entrepreneurial spirit of the black markets will never cease to amaze me.
So a guy like that, like, could he even get out if he wanted to at that point? Like, could he cease if he woke up one day and said, "Hey, I made enough money to take care of my family"? Like,
A lot of times, no. The answer is no. And you can see that initially, a lot of them start doing it because they need the money. And then a lot of them get addicted to that money. But then a lot of them also try to get out, and it's really hard to get out. And that applies to people that are working for the cartel here in the United States as well. Once you see the cartel story that we worked on, you'll see that Americans talk about that too. How the cartel has identified their families, they know where they live, and it's really hard for them to now get out of the trade.
fuck,
Yeah.
that's gnarly.
Yeah, it is gnarly.
I don't know whether to feel bad for them or like, Jesus, I'll maybe I'll make up my mind when I watch the episode. But
yeah, it's interesting that you said you don't know if you should feel bad for them. I think that the big thing for me as a journalist, is that the most important thing is I'm not telling you what to think, but I'm telling you what to think about, right? So I'm giving whatever you can decide if you think you like these people or not, whatever it is, but I want you to think about it, right? And that's why I think, reporting on these black markets is so important, because they are a third of our global economy, and yet we know so very little about them. So by exposing these worlds, by showing people, I'll get you to think about them, and hopefully something will change.
I think it's extremely important to just put it out there and let people decide for themselves. And there's a lot of people out there that like they don't want certain things put out. Like a good example, I was telling you, I had Sean Langan in here. He made a documentary about the war in Ukraine, and he covered on the front. He was on the front lines with Russian soldiers, and nobody's doing that. And he showed these guys sitting around a campfire, like looking at videos of their kids, and like again, there was mass outrage about it. And like I just think, as a journalist, that's your job, to tell you what to think about, not what to think. And the implication by the people that want to silence one side of the narrative is that people are too dumb to make up their own minds.
Yeah, censorship is never good. In any situation, is censorship good? And unfortunately, we're seeing that happening more and more here in the United States, depending on who's in government, on both sides. And then that's really troubling. I also think that journalists, we're going through a big problem with our image right now, the whole fake news of it all, and, believing that journalists are somehow affiliated to one party or the other, and is really dangerous, because journalism is necessary for a healthy government, for a healthy society, for a healthy democracy. And yeah, I think that it's more important to have to have journalists out there than ever.
Yeah, so I know you'll keep pushing, but whoever has the reins at Nat Geo, don't stop doing what you're doing, because the people want it. But yeah, so season 5, what else did you guys get into?
We did a really fun one. I'm going to talk about a fun one.
Okay.
So it's not all depressing.
Yeah.
We did a fun one on street racing. And part of it was filmed here in New York, actually. So very close. So it's like a growing hobby for a lot of people, and not hobby. People are making a lot of money from illegal street racing. It's with cars here in the United States, and they have you seen any of this? There's a lot of footage out there. But we basically got together with a group of people who, on a Saturday night in peak traffic in New York, basically shut down a freeway, and they had a race between these two cars, and it was crazy. So we got that. And then we went to the Dominican Republic, where racing is like one of their biggest hobbies. And they race with these like little bikes, and they lay flats on these bikes with no brakes, and people are killed, and it's very, very, very dangerous, but also really fun to watch. So we did that one. I was happy with that. And then we did a real good, I'm really excited about this one investigation that we did into the rehab industry, because we talk a lot about the opiate crisis and drug trafficking, and I talk a lot about the need for rehabilitation and treatments for drug addicts, and seeing how a lot of the times the same people that are making money out of one end, basically how the rehab industry has become corrupted and how there's real bad actors leading some of these rehabilitation centers, and how it's been really harmful for those most vulnerable and the people that really need help.
Yeah, I think the more money a place has, the more likely there are to be people that get into these sorts of
Mhm.
drugs, especially when you talk about like the pills and like because that's more expensive than the actual heroin.
Yeah.
But I remember hearing stories about people going away to rehab. And again, this is a long time ago, so tell me
Yeah.
how it works now. But I remember hearing stories about people going away to rehab, and basically they came back just as fucked up as they went away.
Yeah.
And rehab is like a center where everybody kind of schemes and finds drugs, and like it's essentially it was just like a vacation that somebody's parents paid for, where they come back the exact same as they were,
Yeah.
maybe
It's
even worse.
Yeah, it's not the same for every rehab center out there, and we badly need rehabilitation and treatment centers, absolutely, and detox centers. But there's a lot of people that realize that there's a lot of money to be made in the rehab industry and have really exploited that. And instead of providing the help when people most desperately need that help, in some cases they actually offer the drugs. And you'll see this in our investigation.
So, like, are these privately owned rehab facilities that are doing this, or are they like government sponsored? How does it work?
So what they do is it's privately owned rehab centers, but that they make money a lot of times through the insurance companies. So before they even allow anyone into their own rehab centers, they either ask about their insurance, and if they don't have insurance, they will sign them up for insurance. That this was happening extensively in Arizona. There was a big racket that was found. The government of Arizona came out and talked about it. They shut down a lot of the rehab facilities. They were targeting indigenous people because they can get access to to health insurance faster. So they would go around and go and drive through tribal lands and reservations and ask, "Do you have insurance?" And they would say, "No." "Do you want to come with me? I'll offer you help. I'll offer you treatment. You can stay in this home for free. It's a really nice home, and I'll sign you up for insurance." And then they're charging insurance thousands of dollars for treatments that they don't give, that a lot of times aren't even provided. And in some cases, there were cases where drugs were provided as a way to keep people in treatment. So you're offering free housing and and charging insurance company tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, some of the people were saying they looked at their insurance bills and they were charging insurance like $10,000 for treatment that they never had.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so it's a real racket. I mean, in some cases, they found out that there were foreigners, Nigerians coming in and running some of these rehab centers. It is insane.
So, like in the cases where they are giving people drugs, is it something like do they? I don't know. I'm just thinking like, do they make people like take the drugs so that they can test positive and use that as proof, that sort of thing?
Yes. So what we were hearing in some cases, and we spoke to a lot of people about this, is that if a person is in a rehab in a sober home, and in order and for example, their time they've reached the end of their time in the sober home or the time that the insurance company is willing to pay for, and sometimes they wanted to reset the clock on those people. And so what they do is they'll give them drugs so that they can go through the detox program again, because you can't be accepted into a detox program unless you pee, you test dirty. Where you have to pee into a cup and you have to test dirty. It's what they called it the golden test. And they stand to actually make more money from the detox facility than they do. The same owners own the detox facilities and the rehab centers, and there's more money to be made from the detox centers than there is from the sober homes. So there's sort of a vicious circle of money making in the backs of these addicts, people that really need help.
God, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Did you talk to any of the owners?
We spoke to one of the owners, and we tried very much to talk to another one who sent us a very threatening legal letter. You will see it in the story.
Okay, so street racing, rehab, what else?
Street racing, rehabs, scams. We did another one on scams. Oh my God. What else did we do? Well, we did one on brides being trafficked in Vietnam.
Brides?
Brides being trafficked to China from Vietnam. bride trafficking, women, because there's a lack of women in China because of the one-child policy. The people would abort the women because they'd want men, and now there's a lack of women in China. Yeah, I think I talked about all of them.
Nice.
Yeah.
So like those brides from they're going to China?
Yeah.
Like for Chinese men,
so
they
there are
just order them?
groups of people that are trafficking, sometimes kidnapping, sometimes paying the families, but essentially forcing women into China to marry men, and then sometimes locking them in. We heard horrible stories, locking them in houses, forcing them to become pregnant, and then having their kids and mistreating them. It's horrible.
Did I ask you about China off camera or on camera?
On camera.
Okay, good. I wanted to make sure that was in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's end it on like a funny funny note maybe. Is there anything that like what stands out as like a funny story or like something that maybe, I don't know, maybe you're in like one of these dark places and like something really funny happens?
It's funny, like funny shit happens all the time. I mean, we spend so much time just waiting around. It's like, rush, rush, rush. You have to be here or else the cartel member is leaving if you're not here within the next 10 minutes. And we rush to get there. And then guess what? We have to wait around for days and days on end for the cartel to eventually show up. That happens all the time. I mean, there's a lot of, there has to be a lot of levity between us team members when we're working on these stories because a lot of the subject matter is so dark. But there are a lot of like funny moments. I was in the Dominican Republic for the racing story, but we actually spent time with a drug lord, a pretty badass drug lord in one of the favelas, one of their slum areas. And he ran his whole operation. His name is El Tigre, the tiger. And he's feared in this very well-known neighborhood in the Dominican Republic. And we got there, and he'd agreed to be interviewed. He wanted a mask. We showed him all our masks, and he wanted just like a black balaclava, like they all wear. But there was one that it was like a tiger mask, and it looked really cool. And he wanted us to call him El Tigre. And I thought, oh my God, this is like perfect. So I'm trying to convince him, actually, why don't you wear this mask? I mean, it goes so well with your identity. And he was like, no, I just want the black balaclava. It's what everybody wears. That's what like on Hollywood movies they're wearing balaclava. But eventually I convinced him, and persistence. And he eventually wore the tiger balaclava. And the funny thing is, like, we finished filming. We're leaving this slum, this favela, this neighborhood. And it's really amazing. It's at the end of the day, the whole place is beaming. People are dancing on the streets. There's like so much life to these places as well. Kids on the streets playing kites. They're flying kites. It's like one of those magical days on Trafficked. And suddenly, just before we're leaving, I turn back and I see that El Tigre has his tiger balaclava and he has his whole posse and he's walking down the street being followed, and he's like wearing his new best, attire and showing it off to the whole neighborhood. And it was one of those moments I was like, huh.
That's great. You're welcome.
You're welcome, sir.
That's awesome.
And that was pretty special. I mean, there's a lot of moments like this. I'm hoping I'm working on eventually very soon writing a book where I'll share all the stuff that, ends on the cutting room floor that people usually don't get to see. Because I think that as somebody who reports on black markets that I have a very depressing, negative view of the world, but it's actually not the case. At the end of the day, I think the biggest message for me is always that I've been able to relate the people that we consider the bad guys, the criminals, the traffickers, and the fact that I'm able to build a bridge and connect with them on a very human basis has given me real optimism about the world. And it's the structures and the systems that play in place that are broken. The people are ultimately very redeemable.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it comes across in your work too. You don't ever seem like you've been tainted by all this crap that you've seen, and you maintain a very level head and an empathetic one at that. So
yeah, ultimately a happy person with a very hopeful view of the world.
Yeah,
even in the darkest times.
Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to the book. I'm happy that you're deciding to write one, because I think that'll be a cool look behind the scenes too. Because people see, I don't even know if we were talking about this off camera or on, but the way that I've become like, again, I do this kind of small time relative to what you do, but I've become such a fan, and like these things that are just beautifully framed up, and these cinematic shots that you guys have, like the way your drone operators, and like the way you guys are framed in interviews, and like the color grading, it's all incredible. So like it's going to be cool to hear about, you know, what goes on behind the scenes and give people an idea of like how much it takes a village. You know?
My God, it takes a village, and yeah, the ups and downs, but a lot of times there's a lot of ups. You know, there's a lot of moments of real love amongst us, and real humor as well that people don't get to see.
Man, this has been, like I said, I was telling you, like when we just took a break before, this has been so awesome. I've had so much fun. I've been, you know, wanting to dive into some of these subjects and haven't yet. And yeah, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming out here to do this. And
I'm so happy you invited me. Thank
me
you.
Too. Me too. So yeah, when the new season comes out, maybe when you guys are in production for 6 and you get renewed, I'll have you back. After you write your book, I would love to have you again. So
book. It's a deal.
It's a deal. Thanks, Mariana. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dalton.
See you guys. That was awesome.
Awesome.
Mariana had to catch a flight, and I got so excited that I forgot to ask her where we can find her. You can watch all 4 seasons of Trafficked on Hulu, and I will also display Mariana's social media links on the screen right now as well. So I hope you guys like this one. This is one of my favorite interviews to date. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you guys for watching. If you got anything out of this video at all, please like the video, leave me a comment, tell me what you thought of the video, tell me who you'd like to see on the show. I really appreciate the support. It goes a long way on these platforms, as you guys know. Most importantly, I have some excellent interviews coming up in the future that I'm really, really excited about. So please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of them. But that's it. Thank you for your support. I really appreciate it, and hope to see you again soon.